Yeah.
Are we good? We're good? Hi.
Hi. Hi.
We're here. This is amazing. A few years ago, I would have never thought this possible, but we have a room full of people gathered together from all around the country, all around the world, to talk about ethics in math. I think this first 30 seconds alone is for me the most exciting part. But ultimately, I don't really want to be here. I want to be in my office, doing my math, which I enjoy. I want you all to be in your offices, doing the research that you enjoy, the teaching that you enjoy. I didn't want people have to travel from as far away as the computer science faculty or even the United States. But we did. We needed to, because we have a problem. And the problem is that we are, most of us, part of a discipline, a community, that for quite a while hasn't addressed something very important that needs to be addressed. And the problem is getting worse, as we can all see. Mathematicians are doing stuff and making a little bit of a mess of it, and no one's ever told them. Until now, which is why we're here. So I said I don't really want to be here, but I am. And the reason I'm here, the main reason, pretty simple. Could all the students in the room please stand up? Undergrads and PhDs. Please stand up. Right. That's why I'm here. Thanks, guys. That's why I'm here. Because we have a duty to teach our students not only the mathematics and the technical understanding of what we do, but also the social context of what's happening. Because for a while, we've been failing them. Because we were maybe failed when we were students. Nobody told us. Because our teachers were failed. Nobody told them. Going back and back and back. But we're going to stop that now. We're going to do something, while we're here, to actually get a community going. And here, this is a community. This is 20 odd people. This is already enough to make a start. To get this going, get us talking to each other, so that we can actually do this in an efficient way. And I claim that at the moment, nobody really knows how to do this. We've all had a bit of a poke and prod, a bit of a try. Some of us have had a bit of success. Most of us have had, all of us have had some decent failures, and the list of failures is very long, because we hit brick walls from the students that we're trying to teach, from our other colleagues. We've all been there. It's hard. It's hard to try and teach something that the person in front of you doesn't think exists. But I think together we can actually put something forward that makes sense, that can be used by others. When I first Googled ethics in maths, looking for resources, I found practically nothing. That was 2 years ago. There's now a Wikipedia page on ethics in math. It was set up by James Franklin, who you'll be hearing from in 2 minutes, all the way from sunny Australia. And why did he set it up? He didn't set it up in the 9 years that he was teaching ethics in math in Australia. He set it up the day after I called him and said, hey, I think your course is really good. We're doing something here in Cambridge. The following day, he set up a Wikipedia page. Because that was when he saw that there was a community. He saw a very small community, but he saw a community. And so stuff like that is what happens when we get together and talk about this. Which is why I think this is really important. So, just a brief introduction. My name is Maurice Kiola. I've invited you all here today and tomorrow to discuss all this. A little bit of housekeeping. Firstly, this is Tam, who's going to be running all the tech feeds and video links and all the magic stuff that's going to be happening here. And this is Betty the Bell. When Betty rings, whoever's talking has to stop. Because we have people talking from 3 different continents, we cannot run over. We're doing this Berlin airdrop style. If you miss your slot, too bad, turn around, come again later. So this is even relevant for video speakers, but local speakers as well. When the bell rings, that's it. Whatever sentence you're halfway through, please stop, because otherwise I'm going to be completely thrown out, and I'll have very irate speakers from all around the world. Are we getting this okay now?
Yeah, just
make sure.
to tell everyone.
Oh yeah, right. So for the local speakers, when you do come up, this doesn't really have much effect in the room, but for the rest of the world, all 6 of them watching, it means that they can hear you, and it also means that we have a recording of this. I think that's the more important part. We have a permanent recording of this up on YouTube. You can download it, send it to your friends, your cousins, whatever, and we can go back and look at it. Look at the discussion, look at what was spoken about, look at what ideas were exchanged. So I think the more valuable part is actually having a permanent record of a meeting like this. How are you for time?
Time?
Let's invite James Franklin from the University of New South Wales.
I should undo that.
Speech. Try the button at the top.
That's mine.
He may have muted himself so that we didn't.
James, if you can hear us, can you unmute your microphone, please?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Very good. Modern life in Australia, although it is done. I'm talking on how I taught the world's only ethics in mathematics course. The University of New South Wales in Sydney taught a professional issues and ethics in mathematics course, 1998 to 2012. I set it up and I taught it most years. I had experience. It's no use asking me for political advice on how to get a course in ethics in mathematics approved. I have no political skills whatsoever, and I didn't cause it to be set up. It fell out of the sky. What happened is that the University of New South Wales is run by a council dominated by outsiders like parliamentarians, businessmen, and they announced that all degree programs were to have a discipline-specific course called Professional Issues and Ethics, intended to give students an introduction to the workplace practices they face after graduation. Employers were complaining that students in many disciplines had good technical skills, but no idea of the job skills needed in the workplace or any overview of where they were going. It was also rumoured that the university feared being sued. They wondered if down the track some graduate would behave badly, take a huge stuff up and then say in court, but in my university training, UNSW, nobody ever did. So individual disciplines were free to develop the course as they saw fit. In medicine and law, they'd been doing that sort of thing for decades. Needless to say, it caught mathematics, shall we say, unprepared. They'd resisted it for some time, but the time had finally come for action. As I had a background in humanities as well as maths, I was invited to do it. Well, invited to do it. The computer science school also begged me to do something for them. That was fine with me, and I said yes. I was given typically 40 to 50 students and 27 contact hours. Up to me what I did. It felt like being presented with a greenfield site and a bulldozer and told to just go for it. So what to do about content? The course, or first thing is that the course was about professional issues as well as ethics. I took that to mean life after graduation. So I looked at job ads in class job ads in maths, that is, for maths jobs, plenty of those in this area, and I invited visiting speakers from industry to say what it was like out there. In later years, I invited ex-students from the course itself. I won't say much more about that aspect, but I did things like giving an overview of mathematics and what I could say about the workplace. There were benefits arising from the school, from the contacts with industry. Later in the course, I went on to ethics. I wondered if I should start with something on foundations and philosophy. That's a tricky question. It's a tricky decision to make. Business ethics books often start with some general remarks on utilitarianism, deontology and matters like that, and then leave it to the reader to make up their own minds. I don't think that is useful. I decided I should do something because mathematicians are the sort of people who ask, where are the axioms? Ethics is an abstract field like mathematics, not an experimental one like biology, so it's a very fair question as to where the principles come from. I think there's some duty to say, make an effort about that. So what a colleague of mine who was teaching the corresponding course in accountancy asked me, what can I do about students who think and tell me there's no such thing as ethics and that it's all a matter of opinion and anybody can do whatever they like? I said, fail them. Then if they come and say, that's not fair, well, you've got them over a barrel. So I gave one lecture on foundations, loosely speaking. I explained briefly the problems of naturalist theories that ethics is just evolved custom and of divine command theories. Both of those theories, I think, are attractive to those students who have any theory at all. Then I said that ethics is based mainly on the axiom of the inherent worth of persons. For those with a philosophy, it's a little bit natural law theory, but I didn't explicitly go into that. After that, I went on to ethical legal issues in the workplace, mainly ones to do with what you could call information ethics. Sydney is a big financial centre, and most maths graduates here go into banking, finance, insurance and similar. There's not, for example, much military work or cryptography here. The issues in those workplaces aren't special to mathematics, but they concern topics like duty of care, conflict of interest, honest dealing, confidentiality, the duty to be properly informed before making decisions, whistleblowing, acting professionally to clients and bosses. Now, that choice of topics is not what I would do if I were writing a book on ethics in mathematics or giving a postgraduate course on it to mathematicians. I had to adapt to the future of the students. So I took it that the aim was to talk about ethical issues that were actually going to arise in the workplaces of the students, irrespective of whether they were specifically related to the mathematical part of their work. I illustrated where possible with local case studies. We have a famous case in Sydney where an actuarial firm produced an estimate of future asbestos-related health claims. They gave the answer that the company hiring them wanted to hear. Then within a year, it was clear that this estimate was complete rubbish and there were serious legal consequences. That is, I think, the kind of case study that tells students that ethical matters are important in the workplace, that they're taken seriously in the workplace and are not just kind of icing or hot air, and also that there is a close link with legal matters and their consequences. Right this week, we have in Australia a Royal Commission into Misconduct in Banking and Finance. It's producing case studies by the truckloads in the news. It's only been going a week and already there are CEOs resigning. Something about giving advice on financial matters to people who are not able to receive the advice because they've been dead for up to 10 years. What I do is dilemmas, which philosophers often like in ethics courses. The kind of story I like is not a bit of this and a bit of that, but something clear-cut like insider trade, a court and jail. In my view, ethics is not just about distinguishing right from wrong. It's more interesting to distinguish between what's allowed but not specially valuable, and on the other hand, what's ethically really worthwhile. Making another million for a bank is okay ethically, but surely there are more ethically exciting ways to spend a working life. I looked at ethically worthwhile. Climate science is a good one that we do a lot of here. One ex-student of the course, Romesh Silva, is a great role model. He became a human rights statistician, working out to gain accurate figures, or fairly accurate figures, for the numbers of people killed in genocides, which are often made up. He worked in East Timor, Chad, and other similar places. What about assessment? It was the opposite of typical maths courses, where they're usually examined by short questions to individuals under exam questions. Assessment in this course was mainly by a single large group assignment with a written report and oral presentation. Groups had to choose their own question in consultation, related to mathematics, but not necessarily closely related to ethics. I was surprised to find that many students felt a sense of intellectual vertigo in having to choose their own question. They've been at school, but when they're asked to think of a question for themselves, they don't know where to start. Interesting. Reaction to the course? Well, it varied. Some students enjoyed doing something different and were quite into it. Others wanted to go back to their DEs and calculations as soon as they could. You won't be surprised to hear that, I'm sure. There was an inevitable problem with the compulsory nature of the course. Those who needed it most liked it least. I recognised that problem because years earlier, I taught a compulsory course on medieval philosophy to seminarians who wanted to be parish priests. It didn't go so well. My colleagues always gave me the fullest support, in the sense that they were ecstatic if I was teaching the course so they didn't have to. They didn't support the existence of the course itself, but they weren't hostile either. The course ended after some time when support from on high disappeared, presumably a change of personnel on council, and then the academics whittled away at it, fewer and fewer students, and eventually it was canned. I didn't complain about that. I'm not interested in politics and I have other things to do. Well, that's what I have to tell you about that. One last thing, as Morris mentioned, I've written a very basic Wikipedia article on ethics and mathematics. Please add to it. That's all I have to tell you. Questions, please.
Right, so do we have any questions for James?
Let's pass the mic around.
Thank you so much for your talk. What would you add now if you were teaching this course again? What new case studies that have happened since you've last done it?
What would I add? Well, I wouldn't have any more time, I presume. I would do my best. I think, in fact, I would add, where possible, more visiting speakers. That was the successful part of the course, in that the students find the workplace credible. So what I tell them, well, they're thinking, I'm an academic that's never had a real job in my life. They're quite right. What would I know? But if I have credible visiting speakers, then they sit up and take notice. The question they most have for visiting speakers is, how can I get an internship? That tells you something about, they are very keen to, they themselves, unlike the academics, are keen to be connected to the workplace. I guess if I had resources, I would try visits to workplaces. That's logistically quite difficult to do, but it's certainly worthwhile. I would have, well, a range of speakers from as many workplaces as possible, and young ones, ideally. I was a little bit doubtful about the ethical perspective of one of the students, an ex-student of mine, and not ex-student of the course, who said to them, I would have taken the statistics job in the company, except my name would have been mud. but I suppose a productive variety of viewpoints won't kill them.
So could you repeat the statement your student made? It sort of cut out a bit.
The statistician said, I would have taken the statistics job with the tobacco company that I was offered, but then I thought twice about it because I thought my name would be mud. It wouldn't look good on my CV if I'd done that.
Do we have more questions or?
Thank you for your talk, James. I might have missed this, but you mentioned that the course ran from 1998 to 2012. What happened in 2012 that caused the story to end?
Well, yeah, the support from it on high disappeared, and my colleagues were able to delete it. It had wound down somewhat the whole process, not just in mathematics, but in a number of other disciplines, was whittled down by academics who didn't really like giving class time to this kind of thing. So, for example, quite early in the process, double degree students were excused on the grounds that they had a wider range of input already. I don't think that was very valid excuse, but it was the excuse used, well, the pretext used by academics to let students off doing these kind of in the end, I think the personnel in the council changed, and whoever it was that was promoting this, the representatives presumably died or left, and we didn't hear, there wasn't enough support from above.
So if I can, it sounds to me like you're saying the problem really was there wasn't value by the faculty. It was coming from above, and when it stopped coming from above, it stopped coming from below.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
But it sounds to me like you're saying the real problem was that this wasn't valued by the faculty.
That's right, it wasn't valued by most academic staff. Yes, my colleagues, as I say, were not exactly, but they didn't see it worthwhile. So when my head of school in the first place to do it, he admitted that it was not something school wanted, and they were not desperate for someone to speak, to teach it, but we will be.
If I just have a follow-up question, in those sort of 14 years that you were teaching that, and 14 years is sort of over half the life of many people in the room now, were there any actual discussions between you and other faculty members of the forum? Oh yeah, this is an interesting idea, let's talk about it amongst ourselves. Did you have anyone at all inside the faculty talking to you about it in some sort of positive way, where you could sort of bounce ideas off them, or maybe even talk about how to improve the course or something like this?
Not really, although towards the end of the course, some people were found to take it over from me who were not too unhappy to do that, two staff who I think volunteered, but they were happy enough. My colleagues, in the meantime, were definitely not interested enough to ask what was going on in it or what I was doing. Of course, they could read and the materials if they wished, but as far as I know, no one did wish to do that.
So there was essentially no discussion at the faculty level of this. It was just thrown onto you to teach, and that was it. There was no sort of bouncing of ideas between you and others.
No, exactly. There was ideas from some of the contacts in India. Wish they had suggestions. And in their business talk and raise ethics they'd set in the workplace. So it was real mathematicians, not mathematics academics. Maybe I did actually have a visiting speaker who was very he gave a talk about the dangers of he knew about a story about tornado predictions. He got that wrong by some very simple error, and enormous numbers of people died in the low-lying regions of Bengal because they falsely predicted some typhoons, and then people ignored it. The real one.
So a mathematical version of the boy who cried wolf. And
yes. So it can be very important to get your mathematical predictions right. The consequences can, in some cases, be extraordinarily large. Yeah, and I think our students, mathematics is not pure mathematics solely. It's to do with people making very decisions in industry that have enormous consequences. I'm sure many people have heard of the story of Wall Street, because a certain formula was overused beyond its parameters to price derivatives. The effects were very large.
Okay, do we have...
Can you ask, instead of passing
Yes,
down, I'm curious when in the students' time they took this class? Was this early students in their career? Were they later in their mathematical studies?
So the question was basically how old were the students taking this course? Were they like early in their studies, undergrad? Were they later, masters, PhD?
A good question. They were originally third-year undergraduate students, and we have both 3 and 4 year degrees. So some of those were doing just before graduating, and it was concluded that that was too late. And the students themselves said we should have heard of those things about employment earlier. So it was moved back to second-year undergraduate, and that was certainly more successful. So students said, hearing those things about what's in mathematics jobs ads and hearing from mathematicians, it gave us a better idea of study, and for example, that they should do this.
Okay. Do we have any more questions coming? To me, there's one interesting point here I want to get back to, which is the fact that sort of intellectually, while doing this, you were quite alone in the faculty, and that's sort of one of the phenomena that I and my colleague Pierce have observed, which is that you get various institutions, math faculties around the world, where there's one person doing this, but exactly one person. And when that happens, you end up not being able to have a conversation with anyone else. Is there anyone else around you who sort of feels the same, that they're a mathematician in an institution where there's no one else they can really talk to about teaching or sort of building an idea of ethics and mathematics? I mean, this I think is part of the difficulty, that it's hard to move it forward without actually having someone that you can chat to in a coffee room about it. This is why I was asking this quite a bit.
That's right, and who is going to provide the course later? The nature of mathematics could be able to be taught by many people who can do it when you retire on, and that's extremely difficult in a case like this.
How did you find people to take it on from you? What was the sort of selection criteria, or was it just last man standing gets the job sort of thing?
How was I selected?
No, how was your successor selected?
It was whoever they could really. Yeah, it's true. I could have studied longer, but I was tired and jaded after about 12 months, and I did well doing it. And they were people that were cooperative people generally and happy to take everything. I told them how to do it. They, of course, gave them the materials and the visiting speakers, and I think it worked adequately. Perhaps I wouldn't say they had great enthusiasm all the same. I think they did a good job, but they wouldn't have volunteered for it by themselves.
Right. I mean, that's already makes it kind of hard, because when you've got someone teaching this who sort of was nudged into it, I guess there's a little bit less enthusiasm, and students probably pick up on this fairly quickly.
Yes, that's right. This especially is because many students are arriving unenthusiastic about it to begin with. They will certainly pick up on unenthusiasm of the student, of the teacher. Yeah, definitely. So when you say about conversations, I certainly had the best conversations about it with the top students of the course. There was a very dynamic one in the first year of the course who helped set the agenda away, and he eventually became a climate scientist. Is still very successful in that area, and she was enthused by what I said about mathematical modelling. So she rounded up some of the other students to request our school to give a course on mathematics. And the school was so surprised to hear from students that they wanted to do something new that they agreed. And that is still one of our more successful courses. So that was a payoff of this course as well.
So here in Cambridge at the moment, the undergraduate students have, in mathematics, have put together a petition amongst themselves, which is to have the faculty put on an official ethics and math course, because what we're doing here at the moment is sort of unofficial in a sense. It's a student society platform, and we still run it, but it hasn't got any faculty backing. So we currently have about 60 odd signatures from the undergraduates, which they're going to eventually put forward to the faculty, saying this should go on the list of official subjects like everything else. And we have various other non-examinable courses that are given in faculty. There's a history of math course, there's a fluids sort of examples course where they pour water down funny stuff and watch it flow. So if we're going to do that, the students said, well, why don't we have an actual ethics course on the list as well? So we'll let you know how that actually pans out. But yeah, what we've observed here is that the faculty members have not been that keen on the idea on the whole, but the students have taken it up, and they've been the ones doing a lot of the work, and they've been the ones showing almost all of the interest. So yes. we have sort of the same thing, that most of our interesting conversations happen between the sort of very small handful of academics who are looking at this and the couple of handfuls of students who are participating. And I don't know if you can see there, but we have these T-shirts that a few of us are wearing. So we got a little sort of community going here already.
Very good. Yeah, that's similar to my experience. So I think student enthusiasm is what will get you there.
And just sort of finally, your statements, those who liked it least needed it most. How did you deal with the fact that you have a student in the room who really needs to learn this and stubbornly refuses to pay attention, basically?
Well, they they have to pay attention because, like any other course, it's assessed. So first of all, they have to join in their group to do their group project. And at the end, I did have a small amount of marks for short answer questions in a class test, so that they had to have attended a number of lectures.
But
yes, it's terror, it's balance of terror,
Was passing this course a hurdle requirement for their degree, or did they just bring down their average?
Yes, so it was necessary to pass the course to complete the degree. Yes.
Wow.
Yeah, that was mandated by the council, that the professional issues and ethics courses should be compulsory in every degree program, and that meant passing them was compulsory. So yes, I had backup from heavy firepower.
You had backup from the very top, but not so much backup from those directly above you and decided basically. Sorry, you cut out then.
Yes, so yeah, definitely. While there was support there, I could do what I liked, and the students had to take it. But as I say, I think because I started with issues about the jobs available, that gave many students a sense that it was actually relevant. So the students are always asking about material, is this relevant to my future careers? Well, there were their future careers in front of them, in job ads and visiting speakers, and they could see that it was directly relevant to them. It was a little bit different for those students who plan to become research mathematicians. On the whole, some of those were unenthusiastic, but many of them were happy to see something about how mathematics is used in the wider in the wider world.
Right. Do we have any other comments or questions?
Hi, James. My question is one that stems from the experience that Maurice had in his lectures in Cambridge, which is more or less as soon as some of the bright students realized that, yes, ethics in mathematics is an issue, it's a question, they then responded with, okay, so can we build an algorithmic theory of ethics? Did you have, I mean, how did the responsive students respond? Did they immediately then want to go and write down the algorithms of ethics?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the bit where you said what the students said.
So the students asked if we could give them an algorithm to solve ethics.
Oh, yes. None of my students said that. In a sense, we're helped by the fact that there's such a close relation between law and ethics. So, in a way, court cases are solving some cases by a kind of algorithm. Of course, they're not an algorithm, but certainly I think there's something to be said, however, for the close relation between equality in mathematics and equality in ethics. While there isn't exactly an algorithm for solving ethical problems, there is something, shall we say, in the way of symmetry arguments in the equality of the worth of persons. That takes you a very long way in ethics. Because of the equality of the worth of persons, it means that everybody has an equal standing in law and in ethics. And that tells you that you should respect everyone. Like, for example, the clients of your firm. The clients of your firm have ethical standing and an equal ethical standing to everyone else. So you shouldn't be dishonest with them just because it's good for your bonus. Everyone's saying that.
Sorry, you cut it just at the end there.
The equality of persons tells you, it means something in the workplace. If you're selling financial products to clients, then you shouldn't treat them like dirt and just people who are going to do something to increase your bonus. They're real people as well. They have to work for you. And I think everybody can understand the thesis of the moral worth of a person and what it tells you about dignity and respect.
Do we have any other sort of final questions or comments for James? One?
Thank you very much for your talk. You focused primarily on what people who learn maths did kind of in the real world. What about the people who stayed within academia? Did you address some of the ethical issues of academics?
Yeah, academic, yes. I didn't attempt to deal with those because of the requirement by council was really about the workplace after graduation outside. It's true, given a little longer, I would have worked a little harder on ethics for academic life. So what to say about ethics for academic life? The American Mathematical Society Code of Ethics has a few obvious things about plagiarism, but maybe the important question about pure mathematics is why do it at all? Given that it sucks in a large number of very powerful, very intellectually powerful people who could be out there maybe curing cancer, why devote resources to pure mathematics? That's a serious problem. I think the answer has to be something like why devote resources to art? find what is fundamentally human to the intellectual part of the rational person about pure mathematics and philosophy, for example, any other abstract field. Somebody should be thinking about that instead of just saying it's obvious.
The observation there, though, is that unlike the arts, mathematicians seek funding from science councils. So there's sort of I guess maybe doublethink is the wrong word, but you know, are we? You know, is a pure mathematician an artist? Is a pure mathematician a scientist? Is a pure mathematician some sort of combination of the two?
Well, it is a combination of the two, but of course an experimental science, using science in the way that art is not, so it can demand more money with menaces because of that. But still, of course, pure mathematicians know they're being useful 100 years down the track. It's not true. It might be, but the chances are it isn't. But nevertheless, mathematicians think they ought to do it because it's interesting. Well, I think that is a demand that the taxpayer is not against. They understand that if you try to sell mathematics to the person in the street, they love stuff like prime numbers. That they know just because it's not useful in their view. They love people who like that kind of thing, and they have to pay a certain amount. You know, if you like to tell them, as of course you're going to tell Parliament useful for cryptography and so on, and that's also true. That's also true. But nevertheless, pure mathematicians, I think, defending themselves and saying they're doing something that's valuable the same way as artists are.
Right. Okay, Sam, how are you for time?
So Fabio's the next speaker.
Okay, so Fabio won't be able to join us today. He's had some health problems. But I'll be giving my slot for the end of the day now, and then someone else is stepping in at the end of the day. So I think for now we can say thanks to James.
Many thanks for having me.
Thanks for speaking, and yeah, we look forward to being in contact again in the future.
Thank you.
All right, thanks. Bye. Check is pretty hard words. Right, just give me 2 minutes to tinker with the amp because I'm a bit worried about speakers. Are you on the max volume there?
Yeah.
Can you go down 2 clicks? Just because I want to slide up.
Right.
May I ask you to put my presentation in? Or do I use, I'm going to be using slides?
Sure, we can put it on here,
Okay.
and then we can screen share, and that will that should work. Are you?
I want to make sure everyone has options. It's in the program.
Yeah. So all we'll do is we'll get it on file, and then we'll screen share, and then
Does everyone have a copy of the program, by the way?
So I will remember
There's a whole bunch.
To use presenters here, right?
No. Yes, you can.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll have it in a separate browser window, and then we'll
So
screen
shall I show
share.
you which file?
Yes, so that would be good.
You've got your multi-port here.
All right. Okay. Do you think we should mute during the break? Or does it matter?
I mean, I'm going to start in like 1 minute. So
Okay. So what we need to do is open a new window and take your file. So it's not been, nothing's been
Yeah, we're going to be like tinkering with everything.
Check.
I was drinking last night because I want to pick through
There's
there and figure ourselves at
before
the potential center.
on a map. Yeah. Oh, there it is.
Oh,
Yeah.
So essentially, if you were participating in these
I'll just
Yeah.
use the recent one.
discussions.
Oh, yeah, ethics and maths.
Projecting.
This one.
sort of ethics or
Yeah.
indoctrination.
I'm gonna copy it to my desk,
I'm trying to get
my
some
desk
sustainable
documents. Yeah, and then don't forget to get
Although I've noticed that basically student indoctrination has to come up with students decide if they disagree.
it. Should work.
Yes.
Then they want to be indoctrinated because
Thanks.
nobody, with their own free will, would ever adopt contrary beliefs.
I suppose there is the capability of getting who you can go to.
To hide behind it.
And I'm sure.
There's a.
Maybe if we Google ethics in math, more stuff will come up. Shall we?
Yeah,
Yeah.
sure. I'm just checking that. Interesting. Where is it? I'm just trying to find out.
No, that's
Well,
one live event.
oh, here it is.
Is there a link to the live stream? One of my friends wants
Yeah.
to watch.
Sure.
If you go onto the EIM website, there are about 4 different places where it says for the live stream, click here.
For
Thus,
this,
the website looks terrible, but
you can also,
I gave you the Wi-Fi.
I've also just emailed the link to all the participants.
right, so we'll try and sort out some Wi-Fi for those who haven't got any.
Is that like
at
this-
the top room.
Live tweet this thing.
Oh, it's on this website. Right?
We definitely don't need.
Okay.
We don't want speakers now.
Right.
No, don't do that. Okay, so I think we're going to kick off again. So unfortunately, Fabio is not able to speak today. He's got some health problems. So we wish him well and hope he gets better quickly. So I'm going to talk to you briefly about what we've been doing in Cambridge with ethics in math, what we've sort of achieved so far, where we got stuck, and the things that we hope to do in the future. So a quick 2-minute summary of how this all began. Basically, I started giving a lecture course in 2015, and after one lecture, the day of the careers fair, I gave the students a sort of short spiel on basically ethics in math, saying, you're going to go to the careers fair today, you're going to look at various employers, and it might be important to think not just about how much they're paying you and how fun math is, but also the actual work that the employers are getting to do and sort of social implications there. And it was a short 9-minute little spiel between the end of my lecture and lunchtime. And then some students came up to me in person or via email and said, thanks for that, that was amazing. No one's ever given us any sort of exposition on ethics in math before. It's funny, I never used the word ethics when I gave my little spiel, but they sort of interpreted it from that, which I thought was interesting. So then I got talking to Piers Purcell-Hall, my collaborator, and he suggested that I give a seminar on this. So we booked a room, we printed some flyers, and gave a seminar. And some people came, about 20, 30 odd. And at the end of the seminar, I said to them, okay, do you want more? And they said, yes. So I gave 3 more seminars. And at the end of those, they said, that was great, we want more. I said, okay, now do some more. Then, now you have to actually put in some from your end. So get yourselves together and form a student society. So they did. And then the following academic year, I gave 8 seminars. And then from that, we had several invited speakers. And then this year, I've given, I think, 11 or 12 seminars. We've had even more invited speakers. And we're producing resources now. So we currently have the first draft of a book, basically. Now this book is going to bifurcate into 2 books, one of which is kind of an airport, sort of not quite novel, but an airport bookstore book that mathematicians could buy while they're waiting for their 5-pound Ryanair flight. And the other is going to be a teaching manual, how to teach ethics to mathematicians, because no such resource exists. Anyone at any university who wants to try and do this, again, Google's ethics in math, gets a Wikipedia page, courtesy of James Franklin, might get a link to the student society we have here, but that's about it. There's nothing much else that's coherently written, that's long and detailed. There are some free-page articles written by various people, or even slightly longer, but nothing telling you how to actually teach this in sort of a systematic way. So the idea is to do that. We got some funding from the university to take on summer students and record some seminars, produce a whole website for this. So we're looking forward to doing that over the summer. I have a small army of students, actually, about 10 of them. Be fun. The actual seminars themselves, this has been the really interesting part. Because the students were learning stuff while we were sort of giving these seminars, and I was learning stuff. And that was the amazing part. To actually sort of get in there and start hearing what their preconceptions were, what they sort of thought were the relevant issues, not the relevant issues. One seminar we sort of tried to get them to develop, this is great, an impartial plagiarism testing algorithm. I really like this. I said, get in little groups and design an impartial plagiarism testing algorithm. And so they all designed various things, and they had parameters flying around their algorithm, and some of them used Google searches, things like this. And so at the end, I got them to present their algorithms, and then I said to the room as a whole, okay, so who thinks that all these algorithms were impartial? And all sort of hands go up. Okay, team 1, why did you choose a parameter of 5? I said, oh, we thought 5 was a good sort of parameter to set. Okay. Team 2, why did you choose 12%? Oh, we thought 12% was a good sort of threshold. Okay. Team 3, why did you choose to do a Google search? Well, we thought Google was reliable enough to sort of go through the data sets and whatnot. Okay, so team 1 chose 5. You chose that number. You chose that number. Team 2 chose 12%. Team 3 is using Google. I mean, I don't know what Google's doing. I think sometimes Google doesn't know what Google's doing. So I asked them, how is all this impartial? And they sort of paused and said, oh, well maybe it's not completely impartial. And then one of them said, oh, but that's okay. We can write an algorithm to determine what the parameters should be. It's like, okay, you're going to write the algorithm. How are you going to write that algorithm? Oh, well, we'll just have to explain. I said, okay, you do realize that you're just moving this notion across one step. And that was really fascinating. When you see mathematicians trying to solve this social problem with more mathematics. And I think that the analogy I like to use here is, oh my God, my house is burning down. Quick, light a fire. This is kind of what you see them doing. Because these are trained mathematicians, they're very good at mathematics, they enjoy mathematics. And whenever they see a problem, what do? You throw some mathematics at it. So they saw the problem of, okay, there's bias in the algorithm. What should we do? Write another algorithm. My house is burning down, quick, light a fire. These sorts of conceptions can be addressed. In the classroom, you can get people to talk about these things, but you have to get them to talk about it before they leave university. Because once they're out the door, they'll go into some large institution, organization, many of them, and they'll quickly absorb whatever culture or belief system is in that organization. They'll sort of lock in to the cultural inertia of where they end up. And then they're kind of lost, in a sense. They'll start to believe that that's the way the world works. This is exactly how we should do things, how mathematics fits into the world. And changing their mind after that's very hard. Kind of like this example I gave of, take an empty bottle of water, or empty bottle, you fill it with water, and that's fairly easy, you just sort of pour the water in. And then say, okay, I want to now fill the bottle with lemonade, but I can't pour the water out. Then try and pour lemonade into a full bottle of water. Most of the lemonade just falls over the top. A little tiny bit mixes at the very neck of the bottle, most of it just falls over. We send our students, our math students, out into the world as empty bottles. They go into a workplace and they get filled for the first time by that particular workplace. And then you try and change their mind later. It's like trying to pour the lemonade into the full bottle. It just flows over, not much is going to sink in. So this is why I feel that it's crucial that we do this sort of stuff here at the university level, where we have rooms full of mathematicians. High school's a bit tricky, because you've got a room full of students, and there'll be a mathematician, and a chemist, and a math historian, and a plumber, and you name it in the room. So you're going to talk about very general concepts of ethics. You know, don't be mean. Don't steal. Once we have a room of mathematicians, we can talk about mathematical ethics. And I don't think there's one right way to do this. And there are lots of ways we should try. And different institutions should try and do it differently to sort of spread the risk, essentially. I don't want the entire world to be using one set of lecture notes for ethics and math. I want there to be, I want universities in the States to come up with their way of doing it, universities in the UK, in Europe to come up with their way, universities in the further east to come up with their way, so that we haven't got one single mindset. Because if you have one sort of set of rules that everyone's following, they end up being almost a set of axioms. And once you've got a set of axioms, it's either incomplete or inconsistent. So you give everyone a set of ethical axioms that they're all following, it either means that there's going to be a hole that can be exploited, or you can use two arguments to argue contradicting points. So while I think this is very important to do, I don't think we should all do it in the same way. But we need to get together as a community to talk about it so that we can actually build something. Build something up, and then this place tinkers with it in one way, this place tinkers with it in another way. So it looks a bit different when it's implemented all over the shop, but the underlying idea is the same. For a mathematician, you need to think about ethics. So that's where we're currently at. And that's why I've invited you all here, as people to talk to. Talk to each other, talk to me, so that we can try and get this moving forward. Now I sort of open up the floor to ask whether anyone has any sort of comments or contributions to what they see we're doing here that might help, might assist, things that you may have done that could help us along, or any sort of comments you have on what I've said so far, or the resources that I'm going to be producing or hoping to be producing. It's currently 2 books. It keeps sort of bifurcating every couple of weeks. So it'll be at least 2 books. But yeah, so please, questions. Yes?
What's the airport book about?
What's the airport book about? Basically a summary of why there are ethical issues in mathematics. So case studies, discussion on the culture of mathematicians, the sorts of things that we do together that the rest of society can't really see. So it'll be a book written for everyone, but it's aimed at mathematicians, and it'll be particularly relevant to young mathematicians, even older mathematicians. That's the target audience. Yeah.
I'm a psychologist, so I come from a different angle, but I'm really aware of what Maurice has been doing. And I'd like to sort of say, when you're dealing with teaching it and looking at a manual, if you want, we've discussed this before, but one of the major things you're going to need to deal with is the actual ethics. They're vague, dynamic, they're ambiguous, they're uncertain. Sorry. Ethics is very uncertain, it's fluid, there's nothing much you can lock onto that will remain the same from situation to situation. So much depends on hidden agendas, people's motivations. And when you're looking at people who are based in mathematics, computer way of thinking, you're looking at people often on the spectrum, not always, but again, have that black or white, narrow focus interest. You also need to look at how do you deal with the anxiety that putting those people in a fluid, ambiguous, uncertain place. And often they'll be the ones, excuse me, as you were saying, Maurice, will be the only ones in the research planning meeting or whatever saying, hey, do we need to think about the impact this is going to have? And while everyone's getting all excited about just focusing on that problem. And that's where ethics can get lost, the excitement in, I can solve that, I can write the algorithm. As a way to avoid the anxiety that is generated by uncertainty.
So we do those two things. Firstly, in most seminars, we would usually have a student or two who would be quite visibly uncomfortable with the material that I was talking about. And they would start to rebut in a very sort of stubborn and difficult way. But it was interesting because each seminar was a different student. Seminar 1, that person was uncomfortable. So they'd be a bit difficult in seminar. Seminar 2, that person was fine, another person was uncomfortable. And so on. So that was quite interesting to see that as the students, different students felt slightly uncomfortable with different ideas, they responded in different ways. There was always someone who responded somewhat negatively, but it was always a different person, usually. Another thing we noticed was students started saying, oh, okay, we get the point, ethics, but ethics is easy. Once you see the problem, it's sort of clear cut what to do. So I was getting fairly clear examples of, look, this is super dodgy. I said, okay, you think ethics is easy? I'll tell you a little story. I went to an ethics talk by Lord Winston, the medical practitioner who's on a lot of TV shows in the UK. It was in Cambridge, and he spoke about ethics and how it's hard and it changes with time as well, and with where you are. And he said that there was a medical test in the I think it's 80s or 90s where some brain medication was being tested. And so they got people in and they had a control group and a group taking medication. And they did all the human testing and it was working fine. And they gave everyone a brain scan. These were just volunteers. They're sort of, at a bus stop, come along and volunteer for this medication. We'll see how it changes your brain pattern. You get put in free lunch. And at the end of the testing, they sort of measured everyone to get an MRI scan and saw the difference in brain activity for those who didn't have medication. And they found someone with a brain tumor. What do you do? So I put this to my class. 2 hands went up simultaneously. Person X, what's your answer? Oh, it's obvious. You tell them they have a brain tumor. Person Y, what's your answer? Oh, it's obvious. You don't tell them to have a brain tumor. Really? And then I watched as the room started to split into 2 halves. The half that said, yes, it's obvious you tell them they have a brain tumor, and the half that said it's obvious you don't tell them. This was fascinating. There was a random room of mathematicians, and they started to split with obvious X, obvious not X. And after a few minutes, I sort of cut them off and said, okay, stop. We've discussed this for hours. You see now how non-obvious it actually is. And they sort of, the 2 halves look at each other and were like, oh, right. Yeah, maybe you've got a point. Maybe this isn't easy. Maybe we can't axiomatize this. So it takes a little bit of nudging to get the mathematicians to realize that, hang on, I can't just bash out an answer in a page and a half like I can with everything else. It's genuinely hard. It's the sort of hard that mathematicians aren't used to. And when they get this sort of hard, difficult problem that they're not used to, they try and solve it with mathematics, which I don't think can always work. In some cases where it might. But they need a different method of problem solving that we don't ever teach them. We don't even tell them this method of problem solving exists. So how can we possibly expect them to know how to use it? So we can continue these sort of discussions at the breaks, and at the end of the day as well. There'll be a big sort of hour-and-a-half discussion where people are free to come and go, whatever, check your email, whatever. But now we have Anna, who's going to speak to us. I forget the top file. Something ethics. Don't go back to the side. Okay, so be sure to talk into the mic so that all 2 viewers around the world can hear you.
I will. Hello, both of you.
So I'm just going to set up your slides.
Thank you.
So here they are. Percent. Okay, that was not the right thing. There we go. That looks way more like presenting than Yay. And now I need to just actually share the screen. Yeah, let's stop that. Okay. I know. Maybe that's because I'm in. I know what's going on. Yeah, let's do that. Woohoo! Oh.
I'm happy to watch that.
Right.
Perhaps you can, in the screen, get both Anna and her slides if you focus the computer.
You mean just manually turn the computer on?
Yeah, and so we can actually see Anna as well.
It's an application window.
Yeah.
If you go back to where you were, there was an option for application window.
Oh.
Yeah.
Ah. Great. Nice catch.
Good team.
I'm so glad I don't have to do this myself.
Can you do screen sharing between
Can I?
video?
Can I go back?
Yeah. In theory.
Can you screen share between video?
I don't know how to do it in this, but on Skype there's a facility whereby you can.
So this is the.
Yeah, should do
broadcast
something.
yourself and your slides.
Right.
So you can explore that at the break.
Yeah, we'll tinker around with it.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm Anna Alexandrova. I'm a senior lecturer in Philosophy of Science, the Department of History and Philosophy of Science here on Free School Lane. And as part of my job, I teach ethics and politics of science, technology, and medicine, questions such as whether truth is the only value against which to evaluate scientific research, about whether or not it can be planned and should be planned and regulated, about whether science, technology, and medicine has a moral or political agenda.
Yeah, you have to keep the mic closer to your mouth because it's not very good.
And I'm not a mathematician nor a philosopher of mathematics. What I have for you to tell you today is other models about how ethics of X developed, where X is a scientific field. And I hope this will be a useful experience. So most self-respecting fields have an ethics, and here are some examples: environmental ethics, medical ethics, bioethics, engineering ethics, research ethics in general, and welfare economics is basically ethics of economics. So it is an absolutely normal part of the course accoutrement. And what is it that makes foreign ethics in a field? Well, a bunch of things. You might have courses and textbooks. You might have dedicated scholarship and academic works focusing specifically on ethics in journals, say. You might have professional codes and review boards. And most importantly, you'd have an ethos and professional ethos about a set of norms about what you should be like as a professional that practitioners more or less consciously endorse. And it is absolutely no question that there is an ethos that mathematicians have. It's just that it may not be an ethos that is particularly receptive to the first three, so to an ethics. So it sounds like from many, not that many, I wish we had more conversations, but from the conversations we've had with Maurice, is that the ethos of mathematics is often excludes an ethics of mathematics. That's the ironic thing. But it can be done, and let me tell you how it's usually done. So I don't have a lot to say on how to organize it institutionally, and what has to happen sociologically for there to be an ethics. But I have a lot of experience of what has to happen intellectually, conceptually, for that, for us to be able to conceive of a field as having an ethics. So let me tell you how it's done. So the model one, which is already mentioned here in the very first talk and by Maurice, is theory first. I have this beautiful picture of a vaulting structure because there is a great ethicist, Annette Bayer, who talked about the great vaulting structure ambition in applied ethics. And that is starting from one of the big high theories, utilitarianism, deontology, virtue ethics, natural law, and then developing and applied ethics as a deduction from one of these great theories. And there is a big model like this. It's not like it hasn't been done. You know, there are lots and lots of textbooks in medical ethics that start with a bunch of chapters on, you know, what utilitarianism, what Kant's deontology is, etc. And then purport to show how to apply those considerations in real cases. And of course, it's a model that's extremely, must be very tempting for a mathematician, right? Because it's a deductive model. And it's not like you wouldn't be the only ones if you went for it. So if some of you may have heard of a famous Princeton ethicist, Peter Singer, very controversial for his unsparing and unflinching and often uncomfortable applications of utilitarianism to, you know, ethics of disability, abortion, euthanasia, all sorts of things. So this is the model one theory first par excellence. You go ahead and you trust that that one of the high theories you've adopted is the right one, and you just go for it. There are lots and lots of reasons to avoid this model, even though it is must be so incredibly tempting because it's such a, it's what mathematicians do as well. Well, reason one is that there are several of these high theories. That's the problem, right? There is an ambition by an ethicist, unfortunately late now, Derek Parfit, to say that actually it is only one theory, because once you begin to see the commonalities between utilitarianism and deontology, we in fact are climbing the same mountain from different sides. That's the title of his last book before he died, Climbing the Mountain. But he really is on his own. Derek Parfit was on his own, thinking that there was no irresolvable conflicts between different theories, different high theories. But for the most part, I think philosophers agree that there is a bunch Sorry. See, it only goes forwards. That's the problem.
Sorry, which slide do you want to go to?
Could you go back to my pretty slide with the church? Yeah. So, yeah.
And while we're these slides also aren't showing up on the live stream. It's just the
really?
PowerPoint window.
Right.
Not full screen slides.
I see.
Thank
Oh,
you.
let's take it out of presenter mode then, and let's
I
just
mean, we can see it like that, that's fine.
yeah. Let's do this.
When Annette Bayer called it the great vaulting structure, what she meant is to say it is a pipe dream. It works in architecture, but it doesn't work intellectually. And that is because even if you manage to figure out which is the correct height theory, the argument that has to take you from the abstract concepts of rights and obligations and utility towards all the way towards real-world conclusions about whether or not you should build a given algorithm, that's an argument that just doesn't exist. It's a pipe dream. So, which is why I think it has been mentioned already this morning, and I just want to reiterate that's probably best to avoid the model first, the theory first model. Okay, next slide, please.
Yeah, good point.
So what would you do if you didn't like this model? Well, there is an obvious other extreme that you could jump in. And it's an extreme that I illustrate with a nice quotation about language from Wittgenstein, just because, you know.
We'll get there. We'll get there.
Mm-hmm.
So if we do this, can we?
One laptop and use the other just to broadcast a video of presenter plus slides. It's suboptimal, but it works okay. Slide.
Slide sorter. All right, that'll work. Let's just keep doing that.
Go to next slide, go to next slide.
Yeah, I have not used this before.
That's okay. Yeah, so have a look at this. Our language can be seen, so this is from Philosophical Investigations. Put that down. Our language, just give them our language can be seen as an ancient city, a maze of little streets and squares and old and new houses, of houses with additions from various periods, and this surrounded by a multitude of new boroughs and straight regular streets and uniform houses. So this is an image of development of language that is haphazard, messy, one by one, and not at all ordered. And that's what Wittgenstein thought about language. You might think the very same about ethics. So if you thought that, you'd be also in extremely good company. Yeah, you would be in the company of the great tradition of casuistry in theology, starting with a case. You'd be in the company of the common law tradition in jurisprudence, starting with a case and thinking about the distance of the case, the current case from the precedent. So you'd be you wouldn't be alone, by far not alone. So what you would do in that case, so have a look at these pictures of textbooks that are explicitly case-based approach. You would start with paradigm cases of right or wrong behavior as a mathematician, and then you'd think about how the case of interest differs or doesn't differ in what features. So you'd be trying to measure distance between the paradigm cases and others. Also not very, nothing precise about it, but then at very least, you are on the ground, and casuistry advocates believe that you have far more reasons, and you have far more hope to converge on an agreement about cases, specific cases, rather than about theories, though not your students apparently in this last story. So next one. And then you could also do something in the middle. Principlism is another really very big model in medical ethics. So this is probably the most used textbook by Childress and Beauchamp. And it starts in the middle, right? So here are 4 principles that medical care, whatever theory you adopt, deontology, utilitarianism, or whatever, would always endorse. Autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, justice. And then there's no particular lexical ordering between these principles. They are all compatible with a bunch of different high theories. They govern analysis of cases, and there will be some cases in which these principles will conflict, and you're going to have to further specify the case or further specify the principle. Again, there is nothing overly particularly precise about it, but I think it's a more popular approach, I think, than either the model theory or case-based. So something like try to build up principles from below. Try to have something like a mid-level theory for your own field. So yeah, thank you. What would you do then? Which is the model you would adopt in mathematics? Well, I think at this stage of inquiry, the best thing the enthusiasts for ethics in mathematics can do is collect a library of cases and analyze this library of cases. Then after that, you will have to see if they generalize to any principles. And one candidate that I'd like to discuss just before I end is the following principle: no research is immune from moral responsibility, no matter how pure. So this is a principle that sounds extremely hard going, right? Because it forces you to foresee or somehow read into even the purest of exercise a certain moral and political context, which can seem futile and uncomfortable, but you really ought to do it. And there are 3 reasons why you ought to do it. And that is because the pure and applied distinction is extremely hard to draw, and those of you who have thought about it probably have seen how quickly pure cases can become applied. Second, because all research is a speech act, and all speech acts carry responsibility. So shouting shouting fire in a crowded theater is a speech act. Studying algebraic geometry is a speech act as well, right? And it's just that it might not be a very harmful speech act initially, it looks like, but there's no reason why it shouldn't be also a speech act which requires a justification. And there's no reason that the only justification for it is some kind of a pure curiosity. Well, and finally, to end, well, not quite ending, I'm going to give you some really fun history. But the final conceptual point I was going to make is that this distinction between pure and applied is neither inevitable nor innocent. And the first thing to do, I think, when you teach your students, in my view, is to start historicizing, start giving them a history of where the ideal of purity in mathematics comes from. So I would recommend very much teaching social history of mathematics. And so here are 2 very important books in history of mathematics that I wish you could see more precisely. One is by Amir Alexander, Jewel at Dawn, and the other one is by Andrew Warwick, Masters of Theory. The first book is a history of where it comes from, this ideal of the otherworldly, young, misunderstood genius. that is such an important ideal in mathematics. And the other one is where the competitive culture of tripos training comes from in 19th century. The reason why it's important to do history is because once you realize that the ideal of purity is a contingent ideal that arose for contingent historical purposes, served some convenient goals at that point, you stop seeing it as somehow essential to mathematics, as somehow inevitable, as somehow unavoidable and right and natural. Amir Alexander tells a story of the transition between 18th century and 19th century, where in the 18th century, mathematician, the golden standard of a mathematician is this curious, childlike figure who sees patterns in nature and can use their smarts to describe nature in a better way. With Romanticism, and especially, of course, Galois, the ideal changes a great deal. It becomes the young, misunderstood genius who goes into his, of course, own world and creates their own reality and no longer needs to explain how the world works. So a big transition into the ideal of who a mathematician is. And this transition happens as part of general, normal, a familiar romantic transition, right? And what happens to this ideal in Cambridge later on is described by Andrew Warwick, and so the rise of the Wrangler who is training other Wranglers, the Wrangler is a very specific kind of masculinity. The Wrangler is extremely disciplined about training for the tripos. The Wrangler is also extremely disciplined with his body. That's why he does a lot of rowing. Healthy disciplining the body is the important becomes an end towards becoming a good Wrangler. And of course, the Wrangler is also apolitical. And that's the really important bit. And the Wrangler begins to see every problem in the world as a problem to be solved in the way that he prepares for the tripos. So in all of those cases, this is my last slide, right? In all of these cases, oh no, not the last slide, purity is not inevitable. And then I think it's completely fair to end with a quotation by Tom Lehrer about the dangers of purity. Did you know that Tom Lehrer also taught mathematics? I didn't know that. I just learned preparing here. And so look at this. Isn't that ironic that it is the mathematician who gives us this completely timeless words about Wernher von Braun? Don't say he's hypocritical, say rather that he's apolitical. Once the rockets are up, who cares where they come down? That's not my department, says Wernher von Braun. So exactly what is in the department of a pure mathematician is a very big question. I do not pretend to answer it, but there has to be something in that department. Right. Thank you.
We'll go for a coffee break, and if anyone wants to ask questions, coffee break, we can do that. So there should be, hopefully, hot water and biscuits, and people outside help us with hot water and biscuits.
I always let versus next start. I mean, school's all British, 3 or 4 points is brilliant. I don't know if it's in 20 minutes.
Sorry. It's good by anyone who wants to.
There's so many things that
Dive in, trend lots of advance. Hopefully
What
being a
time are
bit-
you talking, David?
At 12:30. Yes. Just thought I should get in advance. And,
Sounds good.
anyway, so
I
it's
don't know
just a
why there's so
Beamer
much
presentation,
plastic
so
around.
hopefully it won't give us many griefs as PowerPoint. But I shouldn't say things like that.
Yes. So it hasn't been detected just yet.
So this one seems to take a minute or two sometimes to.
Could also try the multi port.
If it's,
I'm wondering if the plastic is just
yeah, should we try?
many ports. It does take a little.
If alternatively, I can email it to you, but let's see if this works. Well, we're on Candace's camera at the moment. So.
Oh yeah, we are.
Hello world.
Is someone here?
I guess in front of a camera. Okay, no, it doesn't seem to be registering this, does it?
Oh. Hi, Paul.
Is someone here? Yes.
Mute him.
Shall I try emailing you the?
That would be best.
What email address should I use?
It's tambourine hands, tambourine like American instrument.
Tambourine.
Hands.
Okay, just a single. Okay, tambourine.
All one word, lowercase. At gmail.com.
Okay. There's clearly a story behind that, but just don't have time for it. So TANDOURINE. Tambour. Okay, thank you.
So at some point, we might find out analysis.
I tried to make it easy, but this place is once you were in it, it was easy. Yeah. You've got, I mean, we have, did you see the moat? We have a moat. Yeah. We have a moat. It's actually like on the, I think it's on that side, it's actually like dug soil with water flowing through. So this place not only has a gatehouse and large fencing and all that, but it actually has a moat. This makes mathematicians very happy. We like the.
You have a moat and a grass roof. I just found out that the screen is possible.
That's a good problem to have. I can definitely accept that as a problem.
So yeah, I've got some
So north of the.
Yep. Yeah, you can get that. Oh, that's great.
I introductions on his program. Yeah, and I take it from the history of philosophy of science, they teach history of. Oh, hi.
I mean, it's not so much the direct teaching. So,
But she's talking about how this needs to be discovered science. But then she has teach social history and politics. And she brings out two particular books. One is by a former student of mine about the time. I mean, they are dangerous crap.
it's not socialized, but so the way we teach physics in this country is historical development. At least to my degree was basically.
Here there is a project because this has been.
We started with Schrödinger wave equation and went on to rocket.
This is up to you how to classify. Here there is a
But for the example, quantum mechanics, Schrödinger wave equation. But sort of like supervisor Germany, his sort of physics experience. Although he's not a physicist, but basically you start, all quantum mechanics is broad cat notation, because that is the optimal sort of solution. And so maybe not so much the social history, there is a historical benefit to the way that you teach physics. It's a development session. This is an easier bit of maths to do. It's presented first for this physical problem. And then when we reach the limitations of that bit of math, we go on to the next historical progression.
But if you were to come straight into quantum, you would need to be already prepared with some very advanced mathematics.
So that was the example of quantum mechanics.
Yeah. Sure, but I'm taking your example.
So stuff like that. In my course, we taught the mathematics alongside of this.
Yeah.
So it was very much like we didn't touch anything, any sort of linear algebra in the course until we needed to touch it. And then we took longer.
Okay, but I'm not sure what conclusion you want me to draw from.
So her sort of statement that you need to have a historical perspective. Your argument against it seems to be that she's arguing for a compulsory course of history of mathematics in course. But what I'm saying is the other option than having a compulsory course is teaching on a historiography.
Well, of course, if you mean by the way what we teach in mathematics is highly historical, because we get, by the end of A level, we got up to about 1780. And by the end of the first year, we got up to about 1840. At the end of second year, we got up to about 1860. And so what we teach, because mathematics acts in a cumulative way, what we teach is inevitably actually quite historical.
Yeah, there is no narrative. You're teaching
None whatsoever.
You're teaching the abstraction of narrative.
There's implicit
No, I don't think there's a implicit narrative.
Well, there is in the logical sense. Insofar as one block of mathematics depends in some logical sense upon the preceding block.
Yeah, but it's not taught as part of history. It's not
taught as part of history.
That's not done in this way.
It's nonetheless a actual development.
It's a question.
And so therefore, this is kind of
the alternative option to just having a bolting on the history course would be to say, when you're teaching courses.
Yeah, but the problem with that is that mathematicians are very good at doing mathematics. They're not very good at doing history.
No.
Historians are good at doing history, not doing mathematics. If you ask mathematicians to do history, what is not history? It's correct.
You get TC Bell, basically.
Yes, and that would be good if you got TC Bell. That would be very sophisticated and good. But you get is anecdotes. You don't get anything like history. So I mean, the problem is that kind of, I mean, my response to what she was saying was only ironic. She's coming to us saying that you should teach something, some history, and history and philosophy sound precisely has no way of teaching history and mathematics, which is why I mean this department. What is her argument? Oh, well, that's she gave a lecture. There was part of it was she was arguing about the distinction between purely applied and so on. And so you had to see the lecture. But she was saying you need to historicize this. And what she was historicizing was nonsense, simply nonsense. Amir's idea about romanticism and what the other thing about the rainbow. Just embarrassing. I'm Morty.
What do you make of the actions? Thinking about it.
Yes, exactly.
So let's go forward.
Working. It's all local speakers for the next 3 talks, so it's not.
What we were doing, we could see.
He's the high school teacher. High school math teacher who's wanted down and like, he's a psychologist. Trained psychologist teaching math. If you build it, they will come. What size it was? It should be. I can double check for you.
Okay.
Ross.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is run my presentation on this, and you use that one to show me plus the slides, and I'm going to announce that the slides are online on my blog.
Okay.
So that people who are watching remotely must look on an extra window in which they look at the PowerPoint.
Right, that works.
Done.
So we need to unhook.
Yes, just
unhook this.
Just give me that.
The whole thing. Oh, there you go.
Oh. Are you gonna do it yourself?
He'll run his.
So you're joining as a speaker, Ross? You're
And,
gonna join as a speaker?
so, no, what you will do is turn that around so the camera sees me.
Okay.
That's it.
Okay.
Yep.
Fine.
It's okay. I just didn't go that close to the time.
I'll check now. I haven't checked.
If it's not right,
Okay, so I'm going to have to put this here. So.
I'm not sure.
So the remote people will not receive that, right? Because you're not. Have you joined the call?
No, this is the broadcast session.
Okay, so you would like that to be in the background?
Yes, what I'm going to do is stand like this and speak like this.
Would you like me to move
No,
it here?
that's fine.
The angle's not too.
No, that's good. That's exactly as it should be.
Okay.
So those people who don't see the PowerPoint in a separate window will be able to kind of make it out here.
There's no text or anything they have to read?
Doesn't matter.
Okay.
This is good. So just run. No, if you want me to use the microphone.
Yeah.
No, you're just picking up that on the microphone there.
No. No, this microphone is not.
Which one are we?
Hello? Hello? Testing, testing, testing. We seem to be getting audio out, okay? Because the green telltale there is.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, I'd like to now welcome Professor Ross Anderson.
Hi, my talk is on teaching ethics to computer science students. I'm Professor of Security Engineering at the Computer Lab, and because of the difficulties with AV, I've put my slides up on our blog, which is www.lightbluetouchpaper.org, as in what you do with the firework, or alternatively just Google Ross Anderson and click on blog, and my slides are there. I may be live blogging the remaining talks later.
There is also something to retire immediately.
Yes, well, hey, given what's happening to our pensions, I suppose. Anyway.
Ross, microphone close to the mouth.
Okay. So my background is that I was an undergrad here. I did Maths Part 2 and History and Philosophy of Science Part 2. I then went and worked in industry for a dozen years. When public key cryptography came along, I got good at it, and I designed hardware and did all sorts of things. I came back, did a CS PhD, liked it and stayed. So among other things, I teach a second-year course on economics, law, and ethics, which may be of interest because ethics courses are mandatory for computer science students, and economics is mandatory for engineering students. So basically, we joined them up. And since 2013-14, this has been something that I teach. There are 8 lectures. I really need about 24 if I were to do this in any thoroughness, but I can signpost to the students what they need to be thinking about and reading, and I drive them to do lots of reading and to write essays, so we get a little bit more than just 8 hours worth of work out of them, at least out of those who are paying attention. So we start off with a lecture on game theory and the prisoner's dilemma that we then go into, which teaches people that people make decisions all the time about whether you cooperate or whether you fight, and how we can model that. We then look at classical economics. We look at how markets fail, how information markets are different, which is really important for CS students who might be doing a startup someday. We then go into auction theory and mechanism design, and there's then a couple of lectures on law, so that people get an idea of the kind of rules that we have, of how they get made, and how they fail to fit the world of tech, with the lawmakers usually running along 15 years late if you're lucky. And this gives us the introduction to ethics, by which time we've got a clear motivation for it. It's what do you do where the law is unclear or absent? If you're doing a startup, how do you go about figuring out what you can get away with and what you shouldn't get away with? Because after all, the last thing you want is to have your business plan leaks on the front page of The Guardian the day before your IPO. So even if we have to give an instrumental motivation for this stuff, that's there, and it's there in spades. So the first thing that we talk about is cooperation or conflict. And game theory is used in many, many places in computer science. It provides neat mathematical models that kids with a mathematical bent can grasp hold of very easily. Here's the classic presentation, that you've got 2 prisoners, Alfie and Benji, are arrested, and the police take them to separate cells, and they say to each of them, well, if neither of you confesses, then you're each going to get a year for gun possession. But if you confess, Alfie, my boy, then you'll go free, and Benji will get 6 years, unless he also confesses, in which case you're both going to get 3 years. And of course, the other detective says exactly the same thing to Benji in the other cell. And having laid the groundwork for this and defined what a game is and the strategy and all the rest of it, you end up with this canonical form in which Alfie says, well, if Benji is going to confess, then I better confess too, so I get 3 years instead of 6. And if Benji is going to deny, then I better confess, so I get 0 years instead of 1. And Benji thinks the same thing. And the idea that we get across is that this is an inevitable outcome. It's obviously not optimal for the villains. Is this a problem? And if so, What's the solution? So you first get to the question is this a problem? And some people will say, well, they're both villains, so they both go to jail for 3 years, so that's not a problem. I mean, this is how law enforcement works. What are you whinging about? And I say, yeah, okay. Well, let's restate the problem. Let's say that in this corner you've got America and Europe, and in that corner you've got China, and we're talking about CO2 emissions. Or in this corner we've got Britain, and in that corner we've got Spain, and we're talking about fisheries quotas. Okay. And this enables us to get to the idea that you can sometimes fix this if you've got an iterated game, and in fact the iterated games give us models of much of animal behavior. We talk about hot dove games and all the rest of it. Lots of lovely mathematics there. We can say, here is the basis for a principled explanation of quite a large amount of human behavior, organizational behavior, and animal behavior. So by the end of the first lecture, we got them hooked. Then, there's classical economics. Kids are told nowadays that markets fix everything, right? Is this true? Well, markets clearly don't work in the information goods and services industries. IBM, Microsoft, Google, Facebook, anyone? Okay, guys, what's actually going on? So, we spend a lecture slogging through basic classical economics that we might have read in Marshall or in Hal Varian's textbook if you're a little bit younger. And here are the ideas that in a competitive market where firms are price takers, if you look at supply and demand, market demand is that falling green curve there, the marginal cost curve of a given supplier. Firstly starts off falling because you've got your fixed costs, your marginal costs, then the cost goes up because you've got to pay overtime or put on extra shifts or build extra factories or whatever. And the typical company is going to produce at the market clearing price P star, which is set by others, firms are price takers, and it's going to produce the amount Y star because that's where it maximizes its profit. And so the output is that the firm's profits maximize when it sets output so that its marginal cost equals the price P star. This is basic economics, right? It takes you a lecture to get there. And at the end of that time, you can say, well, guys, what if the marginal cost is 0? So how is it that the Encyclopedia Britannica cost my granddad £1,000 in today's money, but nowadays Wikipedia is free? Yes, it's obvious, isn't it? Okay. So guys, how do you make any money out of your startup? Oh, yes. But before we go in there, we touch on the welfare theorems. Arrow and De Breu. Ken Arrow was a fellow of Churchill, that died only last year. Strong Cambridge connection. So an outcome is Pareto optimal if you can't make anyone better off without making someone else worse off. And given that intellectual framework, you've got the first theorem of welfare economics, which says that market equilibrium is Pareto optimal. And the second theorem says that any Pareto optimal allocation can be achieved by market forces, provided preferences are convex. And guess what? CS students can get that. Technical conditions. This is the important bit. You've got some rational actors. Do we have rational actors? Hey guys, see behavioral economics later. Do we have property rights? Well, we're going to talk about network effects in the following lecture. Complete information, no transaction costs. Yeah, I mean, you can see how we are setting the groundwork for discussing real grown-up economics. But before we go there, we say, hang on, Pareto optimality. You can't make anybody better off without making somebody else worse off. So consider North Korea. Kim Jong-un owns everything and nobody else owns anything at all whatsoever. Is that Pareto optimal? Sure, absolute monarchy is Pareto optimal. Suppose you had theoretical communism where everybody owns exactly the same. Is that Pareto optimal? Sure, it's Pareto optimal. So what are you actually proving when you say that a market outcome is Pareto optimal? You're not actually establishing very much, are you? Aha!
Saying that for years.
Yeah. And this brings us to a subsection which lays the ground for later discussion of ethics. Efficiency, welfare, and justice. Efficiency does not imply justice, right? Giving the king all the money is Pareto efficient. And then you can end up with different theories of justice which are consistent with different welfare functions. If welfare W equals some UI, where UI is the utilitarian is the utility of each actor. That gives you Bentham's utilitarian welfare. And of course, if you set W equals min UI, that gives you Rawlsian welfare. So you care about the welfare of the most miserable citizen. And you can start to talk a little bit about distribution here. We mentioned distributional issues. Pigu's point that transferring £1 from Bill Gates to a beggar is generally going to increase welfare. So can't we just come up with some formula for computing W, or for taking a social decision on W? And this then brings us up against the arrow impossibility theorem, which basically says that composing utilities into welfare is hard. Suppose Alice, Bob, and Charlie are voting for X, Y, and Z, and the preferences are in this table here. So Alice prefers X, and then Y, and then Z, and do the circular shift. And how do you go about breaking that tie? Well, this actually goes back to Condorcet. Arrow brought this up to date in the 1940s, and there's lots and lots and lots of maths here. In fact, there was a bright young Indian student who wrote a whole book on the arrow impossibility theorem back in the 1960s, and he won the Nobel Prize in economics and became the last master of Trinity but one. So if you're a mathematician, there's plenty to do here. And it says that there isn't any right. So this brings us on to politics. And politics as a structure of complex exchange among individuals, a structure within which persons seek to secure collectively their own privately defined objectives that cannot be efficiently secured through simple market exchanges. And is it free? Oh, politics has cost too. So at this point, before we go on to other market failures, we look at rent seeking. What happens if the taxi drivers lobby the Mayor of London to put in a minimum fare? Does this mean that taxi drivers earn more money? Well, no, it actually means that the capital value of the taxi license goes up for those taxi drivers who are lucky enough to be license owners, and those who are serfs and merely drive taxis still get minimum wage like they did before. So rent seeking is what drives politics, and an understanding of that is probably necessary if you're ever going to be involved in lobbying for some deal or another for your startup, or alternatively, if you're setting up a company like Uber, whose mission is to smash an existing deal which allows some incumbent firms to extract rents that you would rather liberate so that some of the rents go to the grateful public and other rents end up in your pocket. This dynamic has to be, at least in principle, understood if you're an entrepreneur. And if you're going to think ethically about politics, it's also important. Now we come to the interesting bit, information economics. Lock-in. Right, you go and buy a Mac, you end up buying software for Mac, you buy a Windows box, you end up buying software for Windows, and this locks you in. Same if you go and put music in iTunes or some other system that has got DRM or some lock-in mechanism. And again, there are interesting mathematical things to say about this, which go back not all that far. Shapiro-Varian theorems, mid-1990s. It says the net present value of your customer base is the total cost of switching. So how does this work? Well, suppose it costs an ISP £25 to set up a new customer, and it costs a customer 50p of hassle to switch to a different ISP. Now, if you think up a new business model, like BT with Farm, which was wiretapping everybody's web browsing and selling the results to the advertisers, until it was found to be illegal. But suppose your new business model makes the customer worth £100, you offer the customer £160 cash back to switch, and they're £10 ahead and you're £15 ahead. And when you write this all down properly with the P's and the Q's and discounted cash flows and all the rest of it, you end up concluding that the net present value of Microsoft is pretty well what it would cost people to switch to Google Docs and Linux. How does that work? Well, if you had a law firm, you know, with 100 fee earners busy doing conveyances and suing people, and you're given Microsoft, what, £50 a head for licenses for Office and Windows, then how much would it cost to switch to Linux and Google Docs? Well, £5,000, because if it would cost you less, you'd switch. And if it would cost more, then Microsoft would put up its prices. Really, that's all there is to it. But you can formalize that and you can make it pretty with lots of algebra type stuff, if you can be bothered. But the insight is, of course, what actually matters.
How would you account for the overhead switching to Google?
At this level, you abstract that away.
You might, for instance, have to employ an extra IT person.
Look, the switching cost of going from Google to Linux is the cost of training your staff and your support staff. It's the cost of converting files. It's the cost of dealing with your customers. And that's why at the moment you see mail providers trying, for example, to bring in information rights management mechanisms that are not compatible between platforms. So if you move from using Hotmail or Exchange Online, whatever it's called this week, to moving Gmail to using Gmail, then some of the stuff on which you come to rely doesn't work. And therefore people won't move from Hotmail or whatever it's called this week to Gmail. And so Microsoft can put up its prices. That is how the industry has been driven, right? Since the 1920s, when Tom Watson Sr., who founded IBM, realized, as a breakaway from NCR, realized that it was all about controlling the sales of punch cards rather than controlling the sale of tabulating machines. So, there's coming on for a century of history behind this. Anyway, let me make progress. Social costs of market failure. This is where my research comes in, because each of these factors, high fixed costs and low marginal costs, significant switching costs due to technical lock-in, and network externalities, tends to lead to a dominant firm market model. That's why you have monopolies absolutely everywhere in tech. And so there's a huge race for market share whenever a new information market opens up. This is why you've got 1,000 people each trying to push their own variety of Bitcoin, because it's reckoned that whoever ends up providing the currency for money laundering, drug dealing, and capital flight will be able to make quite a lot of money out of that. Certainly Visa and MasterCard make quite a lot of money out of their duopoly. They're basically taxing the whole internet at 2.5%. Now, what does this also mean? Since the 1990s, Microsoft has been criticized for its philosophy, ship it Tuesday and get it right by version 3. But I think you realize by now that this is entirely rational behavior by Bill Gates. Because if he hadn't been as meticulous as Steve Jobs or as the Unix developers, then somebody else would have won that race. Same goes for Facebook, same goes for all of them. So what happens is that software ends up being insecure and buggy, right? Because the incentives of the people running the market race are not to provide good quality software to the users. They're to lock in the developers, right? And once you have got your network effects going, then you deploy security mechanisms that will lock everybody in to the greatest possible extent. And this leads us into the economics of security and dependability, which is one of our research areas, right? It is not mysterious that Microsoft software is awful. It is inevitable once you understand the market dynamics. And this really matters. Asymmetric information is next. When we were working on early economics of information security, I was in sabbatical at Berkeley, and George Akerlof won the Nobel for a lovely little paper he'd written in 1974 called The Market for Lemons. And the idea you can explain to any primary school child. Suppose you've got a town which has got 100 used cars for sale, and 50 of these are good cars worth a couple of $1,000s, and the other 50 are lemons, as they're called in America, cars that are forever in and out of the repair shop, and they're worth $1,000. So what's the market clearing price going to be for used cars? And somebody says, well, how about $1,500? And I say, yeah, right, okay. So you own a good car. If all you can sell it for is $1,500, when it's worth $2,000, you're going to sell it? No, you're not. See, you run it into the ground. Like with the first car I had, I ran it for about 20 years. I thought of trading it in. The price I was offered was always an insult. Okay? So this is why when you drive a car out the showroom, 30% drops off the price. How do you fix it? And then you discuss warranties, and you discuss Mercedes-approved used cars, and you discuss rating mechanisms on eBay and all the rest of it. And this brings us into the point that where you've got an information failure, one of the ways you fix it is by means of a signal. And this is certainly of interest to mathematicians, Because why on earth should somebody hire someone just because they got a first in pure mathematics? It doesn't make any sense, does it? Yet such youngsters get snapped up easily by investment banks. And the reason is because of asymmetric information in labour markets. It's really difficult to tell at interview whether somebody is bright and diligent. And if you hire someone with a double first from Cambridge, then at least you know that once upon a time they were bright and diligent. They might have discovered sex, drugs, and rock and roll since then, but assuming that there's some correlation between people at different stages of their lives, then a double first may actually be worth something. So there's all sorts of things that you can say about hidden information and hidden action, which are absolutely pervasive and leads to massive surveillance as a mitigation. And this again helps set the stage for ethical discussions later. Another point that we touch on is bounded rationality. Why are people so crazily risk averse? Why do people bother about terrorism? It's not rational to bother about terrorism. Okay, health and safety guidelines say that you should worry about a risk that will kill you with probability 1 in a million this year. So nothing that kills fewer than 60 people in Britain should be paid any attention whatsoever. Right? How many people died in terrorism last year? A dozen. Before that, none. Before that, none. You know, you go back to 2007 and 50 odd died. It's still below the threshold. Sorry, guys. Take the T word out of the dictionary. It shouldn't exist. But people pay attention. Why is that? Well, people deal with risk in irrational ways, okay, which we can model. If you offer people £10 now, or a 50% chance of £20, they will take the £10. Bird in the hand is worth 2 in the bush. But if you offer people a loss of £10 or a 50% chance of a loss of £20, they'll usually prefer the latter. And this is why political decisions are framed as they are. Decisions about vaccination get made differently depending on whether you talk about gains or about losses. And you know, there's solid experimental evidence in that which we go into. How do you turn this into a mathematical thing? Well, Kahneman-Tversky's prospect theory gives you the curves, and again, you can put stuff down in numbers, and you can talk about the relationship between that and you know, Bernoulli's work on preferences and so on. And you can then go on to say that this is why the markets always talk in terms of discount to saving. And there's a whole field of behavioral economics that studies all this stuff. And so if you want to start modeling the messy world of the brains of neurotypical people, hey guys, there are tools that enable you to start to do that. Auctions are next. Auctions are what drives much of the internet. They're not just used to sell cars and bonds and mineral rights, but to sell ads and finance everything that goes click online. And there's cool things you can say about them. Auctions, if they're second price, are strategy proof, which means that you can set up ecosystems in which nobody has to lie, broadly speaking. And there's also the revenue equivalence theorem, which says that in ideal circumstances, all auctions give the same revenue. And like the welfare theorems, this then focuses attention on those places where the world is not ideal, where you have got asymmetric information or signaling or strategic play. Again, we can use very good mathematical models to tell people what sort of aspects of a system you should really pay attention to, where you need matters of law. And this is our next couple of lectures. How do you end up being liable for things you do online? How do you make the agreements you want to enforce them? Then there's a lecture on IT-specific laws, which is enough to bring home the fact that it's rather hard to design laws which are so comprehensive that nobody has to be good. And this finally brings us to ethics. So by this time, I've convinced the class that we need rules, but laws are often 10 years behind and even then don't fit reality very well. So there's a practical ethics question. In what circumstances should we restrain our actions more than the law requires? For example, in medical ethics, doctors observe, or at least pretend to observe, stricter confidentiality than either the law of confidence or data protection law required. This is now moving into reverse, as doctors happily carry around on their laptops the records of millions of people who have never consented to that, but it was a nice idea at the time. And so if you happen to be DeepMind and you're shirking everybody's medical records and not deleting them even when you're caught, how do you justify your startup's novel business model when GDPR isn't going to happen until next month? Well, Alexandra mentioned some of the philosophies of ethics, where you can start off asking what are true moral values and why. And so you get authority theories come from religion. Does that save you? Well, God speaks to us through different prophets and different churches, and they disagree on enough things that people go to war, and it would be nice to have a better way to resolve disputes. Intuitionist theories, which say that we can tell what's good, but then again, people have different intuitions, see above. You've got egoist theories, which say that we act rationally in our own self-interest, see above. We've already kind of dealt with that in the economics lectures. In particular, you've got human Bentham and Mills utilitarianism, where you maximize some UI, but you can't work out the consequences in detail, and you can't argue about how, you can't agree about how W is to be defined. And so one of the things that we do here is to say, well, what do you think of Dick Cheney's ticking bomb argument? Right? There's a nuclear bomb ticking in Lower Manhattan, and the terrorist knows the unlock code, and the only way you can stop Manhattan becoming a real estate development opportunity is by torturing the terrorist baby daughter. Oops, sorry, the Cheney argument was by torturing the terrorist. Oops, I forgot. Anyway, given the current president of the USA, he relished the real estate development opportunity. But as Alexandra put forward, it's nice to have some actual cases to tease out these issues in class discussion. And then there's Rawls' theory of justice about how you should make moral decisions behind the veil of ignorance. If you were going to be reincarnated, which country would you like to be reincarnated in? In America, which has huge opportunities but grinding poverty, or perhaps somewhere like Portugal, which is a bit more socialist, and there aren't the same highs, but there aren't the same lows either. What would people's preferences on that be? Well, again, you can defeat the Rawlsian arguments, I think, if you look at randomized algorithms, which computer scientists are good at. If you had a country with only a small proportion of people who were very, very badly off indeed, then people might roll the dice and say, hey, go for that. Again, decisions are hard. Aristotle's consequentialist theories. Aristotle's view that consequentialist theories are for beasts that would be happier if you were stupid. Motives of the actors matter. Deontology, I'll skip as we're in the last 4 minutes. A more interesting thing is to look at the current debates about evolutionary psychology, about monkeys doing tit for tat, neuroethics, looking at the development of kids, consciousness as an epiphenomenon, and so on. There's experimental ethics. If you've got a trolley rolling downhill and you can pull a lever to cause it to kill one person, or just let it go on down the hill and kill 2 people, then you know how many extra people do you have to save in order to actively pull the lever? Right? This is not something that you get in the classical theories, but it's something in which a lot of people work. And then there's the attitudes of others. People trust moral absolutists more than relativists because absolutists are predictably dependable. And we touch on tech policy debates, and we talk about how you can deal practically with ethics by talking about a survey, a study by the Nuffield Bioethics Council that we contributed to, which has got all this stuff which Alexandra talked about in terms of a mid-level approach, worked out in some detail in the case of access to medical information in cloud-based services and what happens when you add pervasive genomics to the mix. So there's a worked example. But in conclusion, what we're doing is we're teaching ethics to computer scientists who are basically mathematicians, but have the added motivation of whether the code that they write and the business that they start can pass the front page test. If your business plan appears on the front page of The Guardian the day before the IPO, are you completely screwed, or do you sell shares like you can't believe? How can you go about predicting that? We persuade people that rules are needed, because otherwise everybody's going to fight all the time, and you'll end up with the digital equivalent of Somalia or North Yemen or Eastern Afghanistan. And that's not a pleasant place to be. Markets are not enough. That's kind of intuitive to people in IT, but a detailed explanation of why this is the case is, I think, very helpful for more reasons than just discussing ethics. And lawmakers can only do so much. Some idea of where law comes from, of how it's made, Bismarck's dictum that anybody who likes law or sausages shouldn't observe the manufacture of either. And finally, how do you go about doing ethics? Well, classical ethics is very waffly. I remember as an undergraduate sitting through classes and tutorials with Gerard Buchdahl, trying to figure out the difference between the transcendent and the transcendental in Kant. And guys, don't inflict that on math students. Nah.
I was in the seminars, I remember them too.
Yes, well, it's intellectually expanding. And I even wrote my undergraduate thesis on Wilhelm Dilthey, if you must know. But unless you're a bit of a masochist, then classical ethics can be very waffly. So the best way to deal with that is to summarize it and get to the interesting modern stuff like neuroethics, trolleyology, and what you do in practical circumstances. Thank you.
Now, we don't really have time for questions at the moment, but we'll be around in the afternoon for further discussion, for some coffee and lunch breaks. So next up we have James Wright from Holloway.
James, do you have slides or not? Great. Do you want to take the microphone? A bit close.
Sort of 20 to 25, leave it time for questions.
Yeah. Some questions.
Afternoon. Hi, I'm James. I'm a security PhD student at Royal Holloway, and I would like to discuss my sort of experiences of discussing security ethics, or as I would jokingly say, how to build an ethical burn kit when you're already playing with fire. My talk is sort of split into two parts. The first is sort of a brief narrative of how I end up stood in front of you all, and the second part are sort of three things that I feel we should probably address if we're going to start working on ethics in sort of abstract mathematics. So, by training, I'm a theoretical physicist, and in my 4 years of theoretical physics study, my ethical training was a 3-hour lecture, which I walked out of after 2 hours, because the summary was, engineers have ethics, we should have them too. The ethics should be maybe not build nuclear weapons. And that was 4 years. During my undergrad, I procrastinated by sort of floating on the edge of the kind of competitive debating circuit. And whilst I didn't really like their very utilitarian way of doing things, I did enjoy researching sort of the discussions and the nuances of security technologies, the kind of the issues and the debates that go on around them. After failing to become a theoretical physicist for PhDs, my friends persuaded me that maybe I should pursue security research. Didn't know anything about computers, still don't. But when in my applications, I demonstrated enough nuance of understanding of the different ethical issues and debates to at least sort of create structured arguments, and I had some mathematical kind of ability. I was given a PhD so this is how I'm here. So I turn up to my PhD, and my ethical training is 1 hour of the kind of health notice of don't break the law. For the researchers in my department who are malware analysts or do botnets, that's a useful shoreline to have. But I do formal methods research. My research doesn't touch any computers. I don't break any machines. And so whilst our legal professors in our department would say, the law is enough, for me, I felt that that was a bit of a cop-out because the law says nothing about the maths that I work on. So I was without any kind of guidance or shoreline in a void. At that point, the other kind of thing is we were not sort of had any kind of collective discussion of the ethical issue of responsible disclosure, which is if you find a vulnerability in the system, do you tell the people who own that system you have a problem? Again, for the malware researchers, the guidance is you do that. But I spend my day breaking sort of standards, which are glorified legal documents, and I have no kind of responsible disclosure. I throw them into the void of sort of the academic corpus and say, you know, here's your problem, fix it, don't fix it, not my consideration. So that kind of sort of what I was felt problematic. And then other sort of issues kind of compounded it with, we had sort of towards the beginning, just after I started my PhD, the Volkswagen case, where Volkswagen had sued to censor two free security researchers who had discovered the vulnerability in their immobilizer chip. And they had semi-successfully managed to cut out what they felt were problematic parts of that research, and had censored the work. The other thing was Kaspersky Labs published a white paper that said, if, as a researcher, whether you have institutional backing or not, you discover a nation-state's malware, the nation-state is going to give you problems, to put it politely. And so with that in mind, I sort of set up a discussion group, which was sort of a weekly meeting. I would propose a technology or a current affairs issue in sort of security, and then sort of say, right, what are the, let's discuss it. And unfortunately, those discussions kind of had the same structure. They were very utilitarian. So for example, with, say, predictive policing, you would list sort of all the kind of problems that predictive policing would have, and then we would discuss the problems, but that would be it. But the problem was most of the attendees to my discussions, or the regular attendees, they had some implicit mistrust of corporations or the state. And so we'd find all these bad things, we would discuss them, we would nod self-congratulatory if we had seen these things, and then move on. The only really heated discussion was when we had sort of the occasional sort of pro-statist or pro-corporation person come in and go, if these people want the technology, that's fine. As long as you solve the issues that you've pointed out, the technology is fine. The problem that I sort of saw with this is we weren't really exploring the ethical issues of the technologies. So again, going back to predictive policing, sort of saying, should we have seen that sort of putting in biased data sets biases the system? How do we decide on selectors? We weren't asking these questions. So we weren't deriving the problems themselves. By and large, all of the kind of lists that we were coming up with to do our utilitarian calculus were coming from things that we had read in sort of the news or sort of more humanities-based research. And so the kind of the problem there is we're just regurgitating. We're not coming up on seeing the issues for ourselves. Now, I'm lucky to be in a department that's sort of okay with me doing this. The head of our sort of seminar program has recently put on a sort of ethics mini seminar series, and we are in a department whereby sort of we have a mix of pure kind of abstract mathematicians, the cryptographers, to the more applied sort of malware designers, but we also have sociologists and IR people. So there is that kind of crossing of ideas, which is useful. And maybe not for all the abstract mathematicians in the department, but like myself, I'm not that far removed from the harm of my work. But whilst I'm doing just mathematics and it's fine, I can still see over the hill and say, in a few steps, a dedicated computer scientist or whoever can take my mathematics and cause it and use it to cause harm. And so that's about where I'm at now. The three issues, so moving on to the second part, the three issues that I would like to kind of address are how we sort of lab ethical issues in sort of the more abstract side of things, how we identify issues, and then what we do about it afterwards. So the first one. For me, my personal feeling is the best way to lab the ethical issues in this sort of field is through conflict. It's the kind of conflict of personal beliefs and externalities. To kind of use an analogy of this, there is a great sort of swathe of kind of literature and TV on police dramas. And the reason that's usually sort of, I would sort of say that we have that kind of great swathe is there is ample conflict when you're a police officer. You're guided by a set of rigid rules, which may cause injustice to the humans that you operate on, and which is amplified by the fact that you have power over those other humans. So there is that kind of triad of conflict there, that you can write many imaginative things of police officers doing that. For mathematicians, we don't really have that conflict. Our rigid rules are, we must pursue knowledge. For us, abstraction, whether if this abstraction is true or if it's a more applied abstraction, does this abstraction work? We don't have any sort of viewpoints of seeing the power of our abstractions. And in terms of conflict, sort of with the real world or other human interests, the only time we really get into conflicts with the real world is when probably someone takes umbrage to our work. If it's another academic, it's just seen as abstraction via abstraction. If it's someone, if it's seen as saying truth to power, then you have a very binary choice of fight or flight. Do you censor your work, or do you just publish it and let the chips fall where they're meant? But as academics, hopefully in our career, we don't have many of those conflicts. But we don't really have conflicts sort of with the general population. Now, are there models in academia where those conflicts arise? Yes. A very good case is anthropology, where there is a storied history of ethnographic work, where the work has then been used against the populations that they're being studied. There is a reason why anthropology is sort of referred to as the handmaiden of empire and colonialism. And if you sort of apply that kind of triad again of their rigid role is collecting data, they are well aware that the data that they collect can change by their sort of soul, by them collecting the data can change the data they're collecting, but also can harm the people they're collecting from. And they're also well aware that the data has the power to be abused by, even if they have good intentions and don't abuse it, other people can read their data and abuse the population they've collected from. There is still kind of contemporary examples of the US military using anthropology in their current conflicts. So that is sort of the first point. The second point is, how do we sort of find the harms in our work? So as I said in the previous point, all our work will have some power in the real world, whether we kind of do it or whether we sort of see it or others see its potential. When it interacts with the real world, they create a power dynamic. So as researchers, we are most intimate with our work and then probably in the best position of figuring out the harms or the power. But we don't really have the tools necessary to analyze this. However, in the humanities, there are many different sort of lenses which you could use your abstract work to find it and criticize it. Humanities have been doing this for a long time. And so maybe sort of speak to the other humanities, whether it be, in my case, security studies, IR, choose your own lens. My personal sort of things that I use to analyze my work are sort of the structuralist approach and bits of critical theory. Your mileages may vary on that one. But I'm aware in terms of my research, it is problematic of, if the abstract part of it works, I'm helping people build 0 days. And myself applying tools, I'm potentially giving people places to look for 0 days. But the final sort of problem is that if my work is successful and people take heed of my warnings to sort of fix the problems, because I work in critical national infrastructure, I'm in effect securing a surveillance state. I'm sort of saying that the information stream around our energy grids can be used by these people and these people alone. So there are other ethical issues that I've got to consider on that as well. The final point then I would probably say is what to do when you have identified the ethical issues. I feel in academia that we're sort of persuaded or pushed away from having a voice about our work. That there is the culture of publish and perish sort of says you've got to hide your work from other researchers lest it be stolen. Which then sort of has a kind of culture whereby you don't speak about your work publicly. The only sort of times that's probably kind of permitted are at conferences, which is a very insular kind of way of looking at things, that you're sort of saying it's to other academics, or you're doing impact assessments, at which point you're only writing about the good things of your work. But if you sort of spent time, even if it's sort of analyzing the work, just doing the abstraction or analyzing the work to find ethical issues, there needs to be sort of some persuasion of how do you kind of talk about it to the rest of the world? How do you then, how do you provide warnings of saying, I've published this abstract mathematics and I've foreseen it could be used in these problematic ways, or if it's just telling other people, but the other way of saying, if you see your work being abused, either in ways you predicted or otherwise, calling it out and saying, actually, no, this was not what I intended when I did this. I appreciate that I personally fail on some of these tasks. I need to figure out how to do them myself. But I feel that if we're doing this as a community, these are probably the issues that we should address. Thank you very much.
Right, so we'll go into a bit of question discussion. In fact, I can start with one. So you said you're a PhD student, right? So you said that your faculty told you, the department said, just make sure you don't break the law. So at what point did they tell you what the law was?
So if you had done the kind of pen testing course, they told you it was the Computer Misuse Act. If you didn't do the penetration testing course, you had to figure that out yourself.
That's not a very deep, the law is quite big and complicated. We're going to hear more about the law tomorrow. But that's not a lot.
No.
To then send you out into a minefield, saying, well, we hope you know where the mines are. Good luck. So, yeah, I mean, hearing from a younger academic that you're not being well prepared for this, but at least you realize you're not being well prepared. You sort of see, well, there are more mines out there than they're telling me about, so I should be careful.
I mean, as I say, for the malware people, it's fine. The law is a very good sort of red line. But for cryptographers, especially in this current political environment. Whilst there are currently no laws in this country on cryptographic work, there is a political minefield field for them to navigate. That if, you know, doing this work betrays sort of the covenant of the policy of the cryptographic community, or, you know, do you, for saying certain things, want political hammers of God dropped on you? None of this is mentioned, and there's not really any training to prepare for it. You have yourself, you know, you're left up to kind of think about your own personal responses to those conflicts, as I would say they were. But you pray that they never happened. But you need to realize that they may happen to start thinking about them.
And I'm sure Ross Anderson can tell us all a thing or two about cryptography and what happens if you start doing cryptography that people don't like, such as the government.
I've got a question around, so you said you do IR, incident response?
No, so when I said IR, I meant international relations.
Oh.
But different sort of, so I say different humanities lenses. There are different humanities ways of analyzing systems. As I said, I have taken sort of the structuralist, slightly critical theory approach to analyzing the ethical problems of my work. But I would say, whether it being economic theory to analyze the problems of your work, different philosophical approaches, different political approaches, these humanitarian sort of lenses are different ways of analyzing systems. I appreciate there is some translation that you need to undergo to sort of either convert the different lenses in a way that can be used to analyze your abstraction or vice versa, but it's more about sort of trying to find the ethical issues instead of being, you know, humanity saying, here is a list, you know, you've published your work, someone's applied it, and then the humanities or the media has said, here's a list of problems with your work, at which point it's too late. You know, it's more about being able to find them before you release your work into the wild.
Yeah, that was actually like my point, is like at what stage, as the potential problem is manifesting itself, is the intervention. And have you heard of information hazards? There's like, do you know Nick Bostrom?
Yes.
He wrote a thing about information hazards, like this comes up a lot in like security, I guess, other fields related to math as well, applied math. Yeah, information hazard is like defined as like some information that is true, that has the potential to cause harm, or be used by other people who could potentially cause harm. And there's a like paper by him which has a taxonomy of this.
I mean, any sort of warning, the reality of sort of security research is everything we do is dual use. That any paper I publish, whilst as a warning to secure the thing, is also is an instruction manual on how to do the thing. To answer your question on when to intervene, I don't know. I don't have a personal answer of when I would intervene, and I hope that sort of engaging with the community can help me figure that out. Question over there?
And I think it's been really good that you've actually sort of reached out to other people in other institutions to try and understand this a bit better.
I was hoping I could ask a question for both of the last two speakers, if that's okay.
That's right.
I just think it's such a lovely contrast between how Ross treats ethics as whatever needs to happen once the economics runs out, and yours, which is grounded in consciousness raising through a critical theory and awareness of what agendas our ideas serve. And I kind of like yours better. I was hoping to hear, your respective impressions of these different ways of approaching or getting an ethical consciousness going, it's truly different. I hope you realize how much you disagree.
I think that it is an important point, which is that Ross was talking about his work convincing computer scientists to think about ethics, and having tried to do this to mathematicians. What you say about it and what you think about it are two slightly different things. Because if you say exactly what you think, people will leave the room. You need to first sort of hook them in a bit, and then you can tell them a bit more and a bit more. Whereas I think James has spoken more about exactly what he thinks and feels about how ethics sort of works in the context of his discipline. But I'll let you go on.
I mean, in terms of the context of the clashes between, or the differences between what I and Ross are saying, I agree with sort of Ross's derivation, but Ross's derivation, I think, is very kind of structured around that we exist in a capitalist liberal democracy. Now, here are the ethical considerations within the framework for which your work will be operated within. My kind of consciousness aware is that I appreciate that my work can be used in a capitalist Western democracy. But if I publish it into the academic space, there are also authoritarian regimes that are not liberal democracies. There are sort of communist regimes that are not sort of capitalist economic systems that can use my work. The knowledge transcends beyond the framework. So I don't see that there's a difference. I'm just seeing it as a subset of what I'm thinking about. I don't really want to kind of come up with a corpus of here are the problems in this framework, here's the problems in this framework. If I can sort of say, here are what my work can be used for, then those and those different sort of governing frameworks can figure out the adversity of the use of my work in, say, the democracy or the authoritarian regime.
Okay. Do we have Ross? Would you like to add anything to that?
Well, I am involved in the NGO scene. I chair the Foundation for Information Policy Research, and we were one of the founders of EDRI 20 years ago. We will, in fact, have FIPO's 20th birthday at the Computer Lab in May the 29th, if anyone wants to come along and listen to talks about these things. We are aware of the problems of authoritarian regimes, for example. I've helped with Privacy International and ORGUYS work on export control, where on the one hand, export controls were used against us cryptographers, as the USA didn't like the idea that having source code for the certain algorithm on my webpage. That was the debate in the 2000s. The debate more recently has been whether bulk surveillance equipment should be capable of being exported by companies like Sophos to the government in Damascus without having to get an export control license. And we lobbied hard to see to it that export licenses would be required, because in our interpretation, such things should be on the military list, or at least in the dual use list. So yeah, concerns about authoritarian regimes are there, but how far do you go in 8 lectures? The proportion of my class of 80 to 100 CST students who will ever become involved in the NGO scene is tiny. But the proportion of them who is involved in consultancy or startups or whatever is great. So what do you do with 8 hours?
I think teaching them trolley problems is better than teaching them about the fact that their work is inherently political.
Well, if I were to try and wave my hands and talk about structuralism, they'd leave the room.
Yeah.
Or if I gave them the long story of all the frothy Trotskyist factions that used to give each other's throats back when I was an undergraduate. That sort of thing is irrelevant. What I can do, and what I do, is to undermine the trust that they would otherwise inhale from the media and the proposition that markets solve everything. I said, yeah, we're in a capitalist liberal democracy, and we get to really screw people over by causing markets to fail in our favor. And if you want to end up being worth $100 billion like Bill Gates, you've got to make the market fail, and you've got to make it fail straight into your pocket. And this is how you do it. right? Now, some students will take that as an instruction manual. And in the case of other students, it may give them cause for to pause and indulge in moral reflection. What more can you do in 8 hours?
Last question. I think that's actually an interesting point, that when you have a very short amount of time, and of course, if Ross has only got 8 hours, and the fact that he's a professor in computer science, what chance does sort of I, as a postdoc, or James, as a PhD student, have of getting more than 8 minutes out of anyone? All right, we shall now move on. Thank you, James.
So
I have David Pritchard.
let's get your slides up.
So I understand that my poor James role here is to make everybody late for lunch, but fortunately quite a number of the points that I was planning to make in a general sense have already been made more coherently by earlier speakers. I think that's a great thing, actually. I'm discovering that I'm maybe not so far out of line with what smarter people were going to discover as I was fearing, so probably a good thing. Do we have the
one get to be
oh yeah, that'd be good.
Get the slides up. I used to get very self-conscious about the whole AV aspect of giving talks, and a few years ago we had a Nobel laureate giving a talk at Strathclyde, and watching him spend 15 minutes battling unsuccessfully with our AV setup, it validated all those awkward moments I'd spent waiting for things to display. It's officially a task too difficult for Nobel Prize winners to cope with. Do we have that?
It's wow. Thermodynamics is against you.
Damn that thermodynamics. Okay, so I guess I can get started. So what I'm going to be talking about is a project we've been running at the University of Strathclyde for the last few years. And in a sense, it's a highly non-optimal project in that we had the framework and the framing of what we're doing very much imposed on us from elsewhere. It's very much trying to teach ethics within a framework of professionalism and professional identity. And I want to talk, really to focus on the constraints that put on what we were able to do and on how we've, to some extent, tried to undermine and subvert those constraints. And just like to say before I get any further, this is not really a one-person show. I'm responsible for all the bad ideas, but various good ideas have come in from the assorted people who I promised to give credit to there. Yeah, could we have the next slide? Thank you. So a bit about the context. So this is training for PhD students at University of Strathclyde. University context is we're essentially an engineering technological university. The strapline we like to use is the place of useful learning. Cynics like me suggest that the L in learning could probably be safely omitted. And so there's we don't have the same issues with convincing our students who are by and large very applied that their work has real world applications. But we're working in an ethos where the great sin is not to be profitable, rather than the great sin being to be evil, and that colours a lot of the discussion that goes on. Context of the module that we run, a few years ago the university decided that all PhD students should do a credit-bearing course in what they call research and professional development, which is largely filled up with courses on how to do your digital branding and similar stuff. We saw the opportunity to slide something a bit more interesting, possibly a bit more worthwhile in here. I don't know whether taking a framework like that and trying to do something useful with it counts as ethical or unethical, by the way. That's another dilemma for you. Yeah, but we've had early career researchers. Yeah, thank you. So again, we are saturated in these awful TLAs, 3-letter abbreviations. Right, thank you. And so within that, we have a small slice of time corresponding to 2 workshops and 2 assessed essays in a program that's targeting PhD students, typically in their 2nd and 3rd years. So as the slide title there says, in many respects, it's both too little and too late. But I think it's probably typical of the situation a lot of people find themselves in trying to run an ethical component in maths education. And so possibly some of the situations we've encountered will be of interest to other people. Can I have the next slide, please? It's like going back to the old days of somebody sitting up there with a slide projector at the back of the room. It's really, and there's blackboards as well. It's really retro. So as I say, with the framework is courses all our grad students have to do on research and professional development. So everything is framed in terms of professionalism. And that's got some pros and some cons, in my view, as a frame for talking about ethics. The big con, that sort of makes it sound more critical even than I want to be. The great con is that professional ethics is largely self-defensive. It's, if you like, a lot of it is compliance-based, protecting that contract between the profession and the wider society that allows the profession to operate as kind of socially licensed monopoly. So the definition up the top there, which is the first thing I give the students, is taken from a handbook on research ethics in the biomedical sciences. And then I think that's cynical paraphrase from a short play, The Doctor's Dilemma. So you find that if you look at, well, when I found myself looking at codes of professional ethics, the thing that struck me is, firstly, it's very much, you do not do this and you will not get into trouble. That is the pervasive sort of theme. Not a lot of advice on the positive side of ethics, and it's very strongly codified. So for many of our students who want to be conformists, they want to know a set of rules, and if you follow those rules, then your career will flourish and nobody will come after you with a big stick. I'm not knocking that, that's a valuable thing to have, but it's a somewhat incomplete ethical framework in my view, and we already had the suggestion, one of the earlier talks, there's a kind of Gödelian thing going on with codified ethics. They end up being contradictory and or incomplete. If they're only one of those, you're probably doing quite well. In defense of the professionalism framework, I found there were two quite useful points. And again, I think these overlap with some themes other people have talked about. Firstly is, if you start talking about good or bad ethics, you get folks' backs up immediately. We all secretly believe we already know how to be ethical. If you talk about good or poor practice, this is a lesson I first learned talking about plagiarism, by the way, never use the word plagiarism. Talk about good practice and citation and referencing. That's a much more positive way to get people's attention. Same thing I think goes for many of these ethical issues. PhD students, by and large, are willing to believe they've got something to learn in terms of professional development while they're doing PhDs, and it's a less polarizing entry point. The other advantage of talking about ethics and professionalism in the context of mathematicians is it's completely ambiguous whether we're professionals or not. Yeah. Compared with the sort of established professions like law or medicine, well, there's no single route in there, there's no single professional body, and there's no system where you can be kicked out for bad behaviour. If I say I do something absolutely abominable in a lecture, the Council for Mathematical Sciences is not going to revoke my maths licence. This is perhaps fortunate. Now that means immediately when you start talking about professionalism with mathematicians, you're getting into this strange zone where first we have to decide what we mean by this, secondly we have to decide who decides it. You're already in among the ambiguities and the grey areas and the dirty stuff, whether you're getting onto explicitly ethical issues or not. And I found that's quite a helpful route in. So what is it that we actually do? So we've got very little time to work with. We run 2 workshops about a couple of months apart. And it's a very classical seminar format. I send out a list of some preliminary reading to set up the ideas. Nobody reads it, but if they did read it, they'd get some of the issues flagged up. We bring in speakers for as wide a range of perspectives as possible to talk about various aspects of professionalism. Might have somebody talking about grants, for example, and that person might be a real cheerleader for the idea that the most important thing in research is to bring in grant money. Might bring in somebody who wants to talk about open access, for example, who is very big on your major ethical duty is to get your ideas out as widely as possible. As you'll gather, I'm trying to find those of my colleagues who have the most extreme perspectives in a maths department. This is very easy to do. There's the advantage of working in maths departments. But the bulk of these workshops is discussion sessions based around some scenarios. I would call them case studies. They're a bit more fictionalized than classical case studies, but each of them is based on one or more real-world scenarios I'm aware of. The way it works is I split these students up into small groups, give them a chance to discuss while I and the other session leaders circulate, and then we bring them back into a plenary, compare notes, then up comes the next scenario, which may be, we don't take them in a set order, this is likely to be one that picks up on some theme that's emerged. Something to say about the small groups. I set those small groups up in advance. People don't choose their groups. It's 3 to 5 people, and we try and mix up backgrounds, so genders, countries of origin, areas they're working in. The idea is it shouldn't be too easy for a group to decide that it is obvious that ... This is, by and large, worked surprisingly well, but it's been the first important thing our students have discovered, I think, the sheer range of perspectives available. I've also found that they were surprised. Stereotype would suggest that people from some backgrounds are less likely to contribute than others. I've been pleasantly surprised that that wasn't the case. The other important aspect, and the most enjoyable aspect, let's face it, is the playing of devil's advocate. What I tend to find is that when you've got these groups, they want to reach consensus quickly, given any question to answer. And so they're very keen to hide behind a, oh, well, that just depends. Or, oh, well, that's just somebody's perspective, or even an interpretation of the situation that makes it reasonably black and white, reasonably quickly. And so what I do is I wander around and I say, well, it depends, okay, on what does it depend? Or, oh, well, you found, the way this scenario is phrased, you found a nice way out because you all agree this is okay. Well, let's just try tweaking the description of the scenario a bit. Let's make it that little bit more difficult, that little bit more concrete. Let's find something that you can constructively disagree on. This is the advantage of working with fictionalized scenarios. You're not at risk of falling foul of defamation legislation if you suddenly change the facts of the case. And I should say, it also means that once you sharpened up a dilemma, you can then, say, follow up that scenario with the next scenario, which picks up on a similar theme, sharpens it up a bit. Thank you. So I want to just sketch briefly a few scenarios. We give them, it's typically a few paragraphs describing things. And, well, I've nicked these from various sources, mostly online. I want to use these three just to pull out the flavour of the things we're doing. So I tend to start with this first one, which is an authorship dispute. It doesn't look like a principally ethical dilemma at all. So I start with telling a little story. It starts with Dr. A and Dr. B having coffee at a conference and coming up with a good idea between them. Dr. B goes back to the department, talks to Professor C, who's putting in a grant, and so on and so forth, until you get to postdoc Dr. G, who is not terribly confident writing up the final paper because their English isn't very good, so they get their office mate Dr. H to help them out with that. And they simply fire the question, who gets to be on the paper? Who gets to be an author? Now, for PhD students, this is quite a natural question because they're all very attuned to the importance of authorship as academic currency, but it seems quite light. It's not a terribly threatening question. But it's surprising how rapidly it gets into interesting territory. Firstly, it introduces the question of what's fair? How do you define fair? Who's defining the expectations of fairness there? You get into questions of hierarchy quite quickly, because a lot of them are very happy to accept that Professor C, who was on the grant but hasn't actually contributed, should be on the paper. But there's F, who was the undergraduate intern who produced the figures. Oh no, obviously shouldn't. And then you say, well, so is it just possible your perception of what's fair is biased towards people who are higher status? Ooh, and a penny drops there. Also, yep.
Perhaps raise an interesting point there. You have, for instance, someone who's typesetting paper, including the preparation of diagrams. When they finish that, the people who produce the work look at it and think, oh, didn't think of that, and that gets them into a new phase of research.
Yes.
So the person doing the office job has, in a sense, contributed to the work.
Oh, indeed. In fact, I'll come back to that in a moment, if I may, because that raises an interesting point. Which I'll return to in a moment. This sort of feedback between the apparently clerical and the idea-based parts of it. It also gets the students to talk about implicit obligations, sort of debts of honour, if you like, and the financial obligations that are created, or the obligations that are created the moment that money enters the world of academia, the world of research. And what I like is you can then do the pull back and reveal and say, well, there is, of course, a code for determining authorship. It's accepted by the Commission on Publication Ethics. I think it goes back to the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, sets out clear criteria, and under these criteria, not a single person involved in this process ticks enough boxes to be an author on this paper. The whole thing breaks out. It's a very well-codified ethical framework, and this paper is emergent, has no authors. And then you can go and look at the things that are explicitly excluded, like being the person who merely does the clerical work, or being the person who merely gets the grant. And all these merely's, how do they really feed into this network of obligations? And what do we do now this codification is knackered? You have to, again, it's this point that Ross brought up, that when you get to the end of your ethical or legal framework, that point goes your legal framework, your formal framework, that's where you really need to start operating ethically, making up some ways to proceed. So it looks innocent, it is innocent, almost, but it's a good starter question. Second situation I've already had alluded to, it's basically a classical predictive policing. It's a situation, algorithms determine where you deploy police, trained on data from which explicit information about ethnicity is being removed. Can you then turn around and say, well, if the police are picking on ethnicity A, then individual police officers must be racist? By the way, I find it helpful to say, can you pick on individual police officers and say you must be racist, because that sharpens the question immensely for the students. They feel much more uncomfortable dealing with that. Incidentally, quite a lot of our, not quite a lot, a few of our students are on smart cities, big data type projects. They aren't noticeably more familiar with the ethical issues here than many of the rest of our students. I don't know what that says. I find that this initially splits opinion quite strongly between it's purely a technical problem and there's a wider ethical problem to be considered. And as they go on, this question about the illusion of objectivity, the illusion of neutrality really starts to rear its head. That's fairly well known to everybody in this room, so I'm not going to dwell on it. I do want to talk a little bit about the third scenario, the dirty clients. This is my Faustian pact situation. You're in a department which is strapped for money. This is not hard to imagine in mathematics. An external client comes along, they've got a big research contract. This could save one or two of your colleagues' jobs. But there's something a little uncomfortable about it. Not illegal, but just something you personally are not terribly happy with. I don't specify this to the students, because if I do, they just argue with my sticking points. I say, first thing in your group, work out your sticking points. Decide what this thing is that makes you uncomfortable. That's fascinating, because they get a little bit of negotiation over what it is that is, what would be a bad thing. And then say, right, where are your sticking points? Do you have an obligation to your colleagues to put your own silly little personal qualms and scruples aside? How would you feel if you lost your job just because one of your colleagues imposed their ethical views on you? Or do you say no, thus far, no further? People feel very uneasy about this. Obviously, it's a tough situation, but it does start to bring out this issue of where are your red lines? How do you negotiate your red lines? Two interesting things come out of this. First, you can get fantastic cultural differences emerging when you tweak the scenario slightly and say, right, now suppose the dodgy client is your government. Ooh. You find, incidentally, our Scottish students tend to have no problem believing the government is evil. I don't know what that says. Our students from some other countries, where they apparently have more faith in the government, such as Saudi Arabia and China, tend to find this a much more difficult concept to deal with. The other interesting thing I've had is so far one student has played Werner von Braun. I'm very glad we've had the Werner von Braun quotations. It means I don't have to sing it. That would definitely be an ethical breach given my singing voice. But the one we had, the manager's allegiance is ruled by expedience, etc. So I've had so far one student who is prepared to say there is no ethical issue. If what I'm doing is legal, and if I'm doing an honest job for the client, no other issue arises. And he stuck to it, and he knew all the cases, all the classic case studies. He knew about Oppenheimer. He knew about other events in the 1930s and 40s. He was still adamant that all he had to do was be honest for the client, and that was fine. I'll come back to him just towards the end. But hopefully this gets the flavour of the kind of discussions we get coming out of these scenarios. Next slide, please. But so how do the students respond? Well, the frame title there is direct quotation from one student who came up to me afterwards of this sort of expression that somebody has when they've just run 2 marathons back to back. It was good, she said, but it was really intense. I thought, yes, that's. I wish I got that sort of feedback from my calculus lectures, but unfortunately I don't. We tend to find that in the actual workshops, the students respond really well, even although this is coming very late in their career for them to encounter these issues. They are enthusiastic, they are willing to explore things. The debates are great. And again, I wish this happened in my calculus classes. Some students even come back for more when they've got enough credits. Yeah, if you know some of my students, that is an amazing tribute to the fact that they feel they're getting something out of it. Longer term effects, I think, are harder to judge. We have these essays, we're obliged to have the essay component, so because this is credit bearing. Some of the reflection we get in is really interesting and impressive. I had some fantastic essays on the subject of introducing Hippocratic Oath for mathematicians and what would go into it, for example. That was brilliant. Some of it is, on the other hand, distinctly perfunctory. Okay, maybe that's just marking essays. 3 out of the 100 or so essays I've seen so far have been plagiarized. I think it's fair to say that those do not represent a significant moral advance. I'm not talking turn it in 25% plagiarized. I'm talking, yes, you found somebody else's essay in Spanish and ran it through Google Translate. We have since upped the discussion of citation and accreditation in academic writing, by the way, and that does seem to have dropped out. But yeah, fair to say, we don't really know what the long-term effect of this is. But in the short term, people seem to be engaging with some genuine enthusiasm. So on to the last slide, which is me just worrying about things. And a few questions sort of sit there. First, this is a very small-scale enterprise. I'd love to have this sort of system of repeated seminar. I'd love you to have these 8 hours to play with. As if you've probably got about 6 hours to play with, and I'm sure we're not using that time as effectively as we could. Scaling it up beyond this, I think I would get insurrection. We'd be into pitchforks and flaming torches, and my colleagues chapping on my office door and giving me very meaningful looks about the amount of time and effort that was going into this. But how does one take a small and intense event and make it something more widespread, more pervasive, preferably also earlier in people's careers? I would love for these discussions to catch on. I would love to be sitting at one end of the common room, one coffee break, and over here, the PhD students, the other end of the coffee room, talking about some of the scenarios we discussed, or even the extra ones we didn't have time for. I'm not convinced that's happening yet. On the other hand, maybe they just stop talking about it when I'm in the room. This is also possible. But one of the big sort of cultural things, how can we make this a normal sort of conversation to be having? Because if we can, I think a lot of the things that worry us would start to, all these wounds would start to heal. An issue, I better be careful how I phrase this because I want to have a job to go back to on Monday, but we've got to say an institutional ethos which is very applied. To some extent, that can become an ethos of doing what the client or what the customer wants. I'm not saying there's not sound ethical reasons to do what a customer is paying you to do, but it's not necessarily perfectly parallel with what we would like to do ethically. And so we've ended up therefore embedding our ethics training inside a discourse of personal brand management and similar issues and values which are not necessarily identical to the ones that we would, in an ideal world, like people to have. How do we make sure that doesn't shape what we're doing too greatly? How do we find the space to perhaps subvert or question that to some extent? I notice a lot of resonance there with some of the conversations we've been having on picket lines and during the recent strike with how to exist in the neoliberal academy. I think it's some of the same issues finding their way up in different forms. And is it inconsistent that within this framework of formal training, of which I do not entirely approve, with all this credit-bearing malarkey, that we're trying to embed this ethics training, or is it actually undermining itself in its process? I don't know. I do know that we're going to have to worry about that if we see ethics training for mathematicians becoming embedded in the curriculum, because we have many universities have got a very formal credit-driven sort of ethos. And finally, and this is inspired by the student who I shall just refer to as Mr. von Braun, Herr von Braun, who has engaged with everything, who has thought about it, who has read the case studies, and still comes back and totally disagrees with me. I think this is something that reading around what's been written on ethics of mathematicians isn't always clear. Is our sort of mathematician as a moral being, is that somebody who follows a sort of agreed consensual framework within the ethics of mathematics, or is this somebody who is equipped to deal with it, but may still end up totally divergent from the rest of us? I don't know the answers of that. Well, I know what we're going to get, because two mathematicians, three opinions, but is this what we're trying to cultivate? Should we be bearing that in mind right from the start of trying to design anything? Really, because I didn't like the framing within which my module was set, I've tried to push this engagement rather than consensus. Will this have a cost further down the line? We just end up doing all the same unethical things we were doing beforehand, but being better equipped to argue with each other about it. I don't know. It's one for us to think about maybe over the breaks. Thank you.
Thanks for that. So I just want to say quickly first. So you had your stubborn students. You call them the Von Braun. We also have a name for them, but I probably shouldn't repeat it on a live stream. But yeah, it's interesting to see this phenomenon coming up again in a different university, different country, of the mathematician who feels either uncomfortable or just holds a very stubborn opinion, and the more you push them, the more they bury in and dig themselves into that position. And it always becomes harder to convince them the more you try to convince them. The other thing I mentioned was, talking about kind of too little too late, and this idea of an ethics course bolted onto the rest of the degree. And what we're concerned about and trying to address is that if you have a bolt-on ethics course, then even if kids go to it, they'll be like, okay, it's ethics time, and they'll think about things ethically, and then they'll go and do geometry, and go to geometry time, and then they'll go and do analysis, and it's analysis time, and then they go and do statistics, or it's statistics time, and they separate them, because we're mathematicians good at separating stuff, and you only think about ethics in ethics hour. So we're trying to build resources, exercises for students, which they can do at the undergraduate level, which weaves into the actual course. I mean, it'd be good to have the lectures as well, but if it's like giving kids exercises that use topology, that use linear algebra, but framed in a way that you actually have a genuine. Firstly, what is the question? Should I be solving this problem? Should I be figuring out, the maximum way to put some sort of gas in to kill livestock or something, or whatever? So, did you want?
Yeah. I just wanted to pick up on that. That's the bit whereof I was not speaking really, which is what else? Yeah, where else this stuff comes up in curriculum? I see that Bonnie Shulman is speaking. Is it tomorrow or is it later today? But yes, there's a fantastic paper of hers that I came across and I've stolen at least one idea from, which may even be where that example comes from. The 1930s or 40s textbook example. How much poison gas do we need to kill everybody in this city? I think that in a lot of the ethics that comes in, even in these other courses, especially in applied maths, is very much implicit. So among the other things I do by way of reparation for my sins, whatever my sins were at the time, is I teach our introductory Newtonian mechanics course. Once you start thinking ethically about the content of the problems in the average Newtonian mechanics book, it's all bloody ballistics, basically. Right. Yeah, you've got a huge history. I'm aware there are people who know history of mathematics properly in this room. You've certainly got a whole history of the involvement of applied mathematics with the noble and gentle science of killing people for money, going back at least to the Renaissance. You have Cassio, who has been foisted upon the Venetian army precisely because he's an arithmetician and can calculate trajectories and things like that. One of the things I found myself doing is a lot of subtractive ethics in taking out the stuff that would be, the stuff that automatically assumes particular perspectives, like obviously the thing to optimize is this, obviously the thing to optimize is that. I've tried occasionally these little optimization problems where you don't specify the variable you're optimizing. You let them discover that it's money, and then you jump out from behind the bush and shout why. Again, I think there's an example, the design of the pipeline, the oil rig, which came from Schulman paper. So there's some nice stuff out there, but what I'm finding is that the way that these values get embedded in what we teach is very pervasive. Putting the occasional thing in that is deliberately problematic. I think you can work into a surprising number of classes. I agree with you there. And subtracting the stuff that makes these awful built-in assumptions seems also to me to be important. I've got a lot fewer. In fact, I may not have a single bullet-based or cannonball-based example in my mechanics class anymore, unless somebody else has snuck one back in there. Being very conscious of this, and every so often taking the opportunity to explain why we're not doing this. You know, why you won't find these same examples you find in many of the textbooks. Just putting a little bit of itching powder into down back people's necks as they're studying these subjects. I would like to think it has an abiding effect. I know some random throwaway things that lecturers said when I was trying to have a nice sleep during Tricross Part 1A and Part 1B had an effect later on in my life. I'd like to think that that sort of thing matters, and it's something we should be thinking about. Even if we can't get formalized ethics training at that level, can we get these little provocations built in?
Okay, so thank you. I'm just going to queue up a pre-recorded message by Vint Cerf, who, those of you who don't know, he's a computer scientist. He was involved in the development of the internet, that thing. He also worked on the Saturn V project, just as a side thing he did as well. Pretty impressive resume. He's a Turing Prize recipient. And he gave us a nice 5-minute pre-recorded video. And in true high-tech fashion, I'm going to stick this microphone in front of this speaker so that the live stream can hear the audio coming out. I'm not going to know how to do it at the moment.
Confused.
Hello, my name is Vint Cerf. I'm Google's Chief Internet Evangelist, and it's a pleasure to talk to you today. I wish I could be with you in person because some of the topics you'll be discussing are very near and dear to my heart. Terabit per second services were something that I actually tried to accomplish way back in the early 1980s. I won't waste your time telling you too much about that because in the end it didn't work out very well. But there was a great excitement about the possibility of achieving speeds like that. If we get there, it seems to me that many tasks that we consider to be overly time-consuming, like moving large amounts of data from one place to another, suddenly become trivial and become nearly real time. And I think that's one of the key issues about the significant changes that occur when things scale up in one way or another. A good example is a spreadsheet, something that you laboriously did with a mechanical calculator that took you a week to fill out. It's suddenly real time, in which case it becomes a tool for exploring a parameter space that you can change in literally real time. And so terabit per second communication capacity will probably create real-time behaviors that otherwise would not have been so. So I think all of us are quite curious, including me, to know what those might be. Some of the questions that I've been asked to try to answer are not so easy, but what went right in the last 25 years and what went wrong. The short story from my point of view is that we achieved building a global scale internet. Half the world's population is online, and the other half we hope will come online in the next few years. And I think that went right in many ways. Many technologies came along, including optical fiber communications, mobile communication, to make the internet more useful and more accessible. In terms of what went wrong, well, the general public has access to the internet, and some parts of the general public don't have your best interest in mind. They create malware, they generate denial of service attacks, they send spam, they try to defraud people. There are a whole list of things that people do with the internet that you wish they didn't. Unfortunately, people are people. And so I think our big challenge over the succeeding 25 years is to figure out how to protect against the ills that are visited upon us in this online environment while preserving the human rights, freedom of expression, freedom to find information or share information, all the benefits that we find from putting literally the world's information at our fingertips. So let's hope that we find a solution to that over the next 25 years. I think that in general, we're moving in a fascinating direction in networking, particularly the software-defined nets, which I used to dismiss by saying, well, it's all software, that's what routers are full of, and so what is this? But in fact, looking at bare bones hardware switches that then can be programmed to alter their switching behavior is actually a pretty interesting proposition. And the more I look at that, the more I see potential flexibility in the way in which networking is actually structured to work. And it raises all kinds of interesting questions about multiple brands of hardware switches with software sitting inside or on top, interworking with each other for the same reasons that I'm curious about clouds interacting with each other. We're going to have to establish new kind of standards, new sorts of architectural commonality in order to create this interworkability that I think is always important when we're dealing with hardware and software environments with a diversity of suppliers. So that's really what I'm looking forward to over the next several years, is achieving new concepts in network architecture that will allow interworking among a very complex set of devices. That also, of course, includes the Internet of Things, which is another tidal wave that's coming. So the last question I was asked is, will we ever have a secure network? And I think the answer is probably not. And the best we can do is to successively reduce risk, either because of new software and hardware methods or better behavior by people. But all we can do is diminish the risks that arise when we're in this online fully connected environment. And I think that's probably about as much as anyone can expect. Well, sorry I can't be with you in person, but I'll see you on the net.
That's great.
And now we have lunch.
Maurice, how is lunch organized?
Catering was supposed to come and bring food. So, there's food. Good. Some miracle, this worked.
Just wanted to say thank you for all the technical stuff.
Sure.
I appreciate that. I appreciate it's an overlooked and stressful job, so thank you.
If my calculations are correct, I do have enough food for everyone in the room.
All right.
So, for example, this workshop.
Yes.
Interesting.
Well, yeah, you keep cutting the last piece in half, right?
Who is this? How many people do you know about?
Almost none, because we've only just started.
I was thinking about in terms of scaling and which universities.
This would be a good place to start to announce that. And we haven't got many. I guess we've got some details that we can give, at least just to start the recruitment process.
Yeah, in terms
going.
of like which universities would be interested in and might have students in mind for anything.
I mean, I'm sure anyone here who has any mathematician here can basically go home and grab 2 students and send them off to the Cambridge room.
Some of my students are quite large, that could be problematic.
But yeah.
In terms of scaling the impact of this particular event and connect people who are already interested to follow up, to do follow-up kinds of collaboration.
Are we gonna pause the broadcast, by the way?
I think that makes sense.
Yeah, because also we've got an
So
8
we
hour.
can't pause it.
So stop it and rename Friday afternoon.
Oh yeah, that's true. Do you want to say something? Like,
We should certainly
We're now stopping the broadcast and resuming in about an hour.
That's all, folks.